I'm going to call this meeting of the Lower Savannah-Salkehatchie River Basin Council to order, our September 5th. I think I had this as meeting number 9. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Today we're going to be drought management, groundwater resources, groundwater management plans. At this time, do I have someone who will help me approve the agenda? Motion by Dean. Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, good. You were provided copies of the minutes from our August 1st as well as the summary. I don't know if you received any corrections or not. Anyone have any?
Just one little small one, it's just typos.
One little typo, anything else? All right, if not, I'll entertain a motion to approve those. Motion from Bill. Second.
Second.
All right, Pete. All right, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, any opposed? All right, great. Newsworthy items. What does anyone have for us today? Anything? I think there was a flyer included in our, is that something that someone wanted to mention?
John, did you want to mention that? The rain barrel?
Yeah, I'm having trouble recalling all the details, but there's another rain barrel seminar coming up. And this is a how-to, but they also provide the materials, including rain barrel and then the fittings and so forth. And instructions on how you can attach it to a downspout. It's the most common use of it in a residential setting. So I have one and it works really great. I've thought about ganging two together, but Mama says there ain't room for that. So we're not doing that.
Anything else?
Debbie took most of the state out of drought, is that right?
She's upstairs.
Oh, because the whole state out of drought?
No.
No. Wrong.
We just, well, the drought committee convened yesterday via teleconference and upgraded the portions of the upper Savannah to moderate stage of drought. They added Aiken into incipient drought and maintained Lawrence and Greenwood in, they maintained Lawrence and Greenwood in incipient drought. The rest of the state remains in no drought and will reconvene on September 25th.
Great. That's it. I'll turn it over to.
Okay. All right, public comments. Well, before we do that, there's a few RBC members online. I think Tommy Paradise, Leslie Dickerson, and Jeff Hines. Public comment. Anyone online or in the room want to make comment or agency comment? Joe, did you want to make agency comment like you did at the Saluda?
Sure, I think I made one with this group online last time I was here. So I'm Joe Kuhn, Division Director of Water Resources with the newly formed DES. And so the hydrology group managed here by Scott Harder has become part of that division in the newly formed DES. So all of their responsibilities are now under the Department of Environmental Services. And we also have our water quantity group, which I'll speak a bit about the capacity use program today. And then we also have our private well program and underground injection control program. That's part of that water resources division. And so that's the general update. I think I mentioned maybe changing the name of the hydrology group, but we've decided to stay with hydrology. So that's my update.
Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about what we talked about last month. We focused last month on ecological flow results. And if you recall, Luke Bauer and Brandon Peoples, I can't remember if it was Luke or Brandon.
Just Brandon.
It was Brandon that talked about that. There really wasn't a whole lot to talk about in this basin, and I'll explain why in just a minute. I also presented some just comparisons to minimum in-stream flows. And those comparisons stem out of the DNR in-stream flow policy that was then adopted as part of regulations where they set minimum in-stream flows for new permittees. They don't really apply across the state for the most part because most permittees are grandfathered. Only new permittees since the surface water law came into effect. But it doesn't mean we still can't do comparisons looking at our different planning scenarios to minimum in-stream flows and look at how often those flows in our planning scenarios drop below the minimum in-stream flow amount. One of the problems or difficulties in doing that on the Savannah model and in Savannah Basin is that we can't really do it on the main stem of the Savannah because of the regulated releases from Thurman. So they release a minimum amount from Thurman that is above what the calculated minimum in-stream flow would be. And since we use USGS gauge data to calculate the minimum in-stream flows based on that 20, 30, 40% of mean annual daily flow, it doesn't really make for a good comparison because the flows are regulated. So we didn't do any comparisons on the main stem of the Savannah River. We did one comparison up on Horse Creek because there's upstream withdrawals and discharges, and there's a gauge there. And that table on the right showed the percentage of time under each of our planning scenarios when flow drops below the minimum in-stream flow. So unimpaired flow conditions, which is what that UIF stands for, it's only 0.1% of the time. Under current use conditions, which reflects some withdrawals from Breezy Hill and Graniteville, and a golf course, and then some discharges, I believe, too, that aren't shown. It goes up to 0.2% of the time. So not a big difference where in the frequency of time that you drop below minimum stream flow. And then in our 2070 moderate and 2070 high demand scenarios, it goes up to 0.3% or 1%. If we run the fully permitted registered scenario, then it almost is 5%. But that was really the only spot where we could do that. I mean, there's gauges down here where we could do it. But really, there's only discharges to these locations from the Savannah River site on Upper Three Rivers and Tinker Creek. So there's not a lot of opportunities to even do this comparison in the lower Savannah. There was one site, again, the same Horse Creek site, where Brandon presented the results of the ecological flow analysis, and it also showed that there was really low risk to aquatic ecology based on changes in flows for these different planning scenarios. So it wasn't a lot of information we could glean out of that, other than that there was really no risk at this point. And that point reflected conditions in Horse Creek. Moving over to the Salkehatchie Basin, there was a couple more areas where we could do the comparison of minimum in-stream flows. We talked a little bit about the comparison on the Caloosahatchee and how it was different than the other comparisons, in that minimum in-stream flows or the frequency of flow in our planning scenarios that drop below minimum in-stream flow are in the 40s and even 50%. And that's quite unique, and it reflects the unique hydrology of this system here. Very flashy, basically. In fact, I think on this next slide, we showed the flashiness. So this is, a log scale all the way up to 1,000 CFS and even 10,000 CFS down to 0.1 CFS. And there's a lot of variability in the Caloosahatchee River. And because of that, there's a lot of times where you drop below the minimum in-stream flow based on that 20, 30, 40% of mean annual flow rule. What we want to look at is there much difference between the different planning scenarios? And there really isn't. Until maybe you get to the permitted and registered scenario, and then it goes up about 5%. But we're not really focused as much on the permitted and registered scenario because we typically don't see withdrawals at the fully permitted registered amount. Over on the Salkehatchie River and the Combahee River, we had some other comparisons, and again, there really isn't a lot of difference between the current moderate and high demand scenarios at those locations either. So any questions about that? Okay, let's move on. Brad O'Neill gave a great presentation and discussion about Coosaw Farms and how he manages water, their overall philosophy, which he tries to follow the triple bottom line approach: people, profit, and planet. And then he talked about methods of irrigation. He's got a lot of different methods: center pivot, he's got micro emitters, and he's got solid set sprinklers, which he uses for to create prevent freezing on his blueberries. He reuses a lot of water, so he showed us this picture of his filter stations that clean the water so that he can reapply it. He talked about how he uses moisture sensors to gauge the level of moisture and not overwater or underwater. And then he talked about his strategy for conservation, where he captures rainwater at a series of different ponds using ditches and canals, and how he applies that then. And what I thought was most interesting basically then was this map, and all these red dots I think reflect pumps or channels. I think maybe pumps. If I remember, I think they're pumps, right? So lifts, yeah, he helps move water around from all these different ponds and locations to his different sites. So that was a great presentation. I've been looking at all the RBCs for somebody to talk about how they use water, and Brad's was just hit the nail on the head for agriculture. Angel, you weren't here, but you have anything to add for the operations you're familiar with?
We use center pivots. He uses a larger variety of. So he probably is a better person.
Okay. All right. Okay, that brings us to today's topic, which is picking up where we left off last time, talking about drought response. And this time around, we want to really put pen to paper and develop strategies and recommendations. So a quick overview again of what the planning framework requires of each RBC. The RBCs are intended to collect and evaluate local hydrologic information for drought assessment, provide that information to the DMA or the DRC, help communicate drought conditions and drought declarations to the rest of the RBC, to stakeholders, to the public, advocate for basin-wide coordinated responses for drought management, and help coordinate different drought management groups in the region or basin as needed. That's what the planning framework suggests the RBC's responsibilities are. For Chapter 8, what we want to do is we want to summarize existing drought plans and drought advisory groups. And if you remember back one of the first or second meetings, we circulated a table of existing drought management plans. I'm going to put you on the spot. Have you guys written one yet? You prepared one?
We, as a joint municipal system, we have separate drought management systems for each town.
Okay.
That needs some updating.
Okay. Good. And you're working on that, right? Or they're working on that?
We're working on that. But yeah, so and I don't think that we intend to, I mean, we'll do it jointly, but as they're separate systems, they probably will. I mean, each individual town has individual, users or different, differences, but I don't think it's our intent to do one for the whole, all separate systems, but
That makes sense.
one thing we're discussing, yeah.
Okay.
We have a draft one going, John, that Elliot with folks' offices reviewed, and it's gonna be, it's in draft. It's an update, of our current one.
Yeah.
I think I'll try to get our commission to adopt it this fall.
Good. Okay. What about,
Ours is too. I've been talking with Hud a fair bit about that. We've still got some few issues that we're trying to iron out exactly how we monitor and check on things, but
Yep.
it's working. Good.
and you for Jasper, is yours already up to date or?
No, I was still, I think it was like 2008,
Okay.
so it's still in that state.
John,
Aiken's much the same as 2005. And the city staff is not seeing a push, a requirement to update. They may be perfectly correct, but without some direction for a periodic update to set a milestone and do your budget and work towards, it's hard for them to move that way, if that makes sense. They're happy with their 2005 plan, such as it is.
okay. So Elliot authored that draft kind of guideline manual, and y'all been doing presentations and kind of pushing that out. From what I'm hearing, it sounds like a fair number of utilities are updating their plans, right? Is that a fair assessment?
It is, and again, thanks to Hope Mazel, the State Climatology Office and Drought Response Program, for those that don't know me, and I brought a few extra copies of this today. We have been working with the South Carolina Rural Water Association to hold workshops around the state, because you're 100% correct. We don't legislatively have any state or anything to force water systems to update their plan, except to recognize that most of them haven't been looked at since 2003. And so when and if we do get into one of those really serious hydrologic droughts, you know, for all of us, plans that haven't been looked at since 2003. So most of the workshops, we've had anywhere from 5 to 10 water systems that have come to the workshops. You don't have to come to the workshops. Those came really wanting to look at each individual section within the plan. But this is out there. It's a drought guidebook. It has a checklist in the beginning. It also has case studies from water systems around South Carolina for what's working, some of the lessons learned from them as they have updated their plan. This is a great resource to help jumpstart the process for water systems that do want to update their plans. And we're available. We can get on the phone with you, answer questions, and work with the water systems through this process of updating it. We do ask, simply because the way the legislation is written, that if you update your plan, ideally you would send it to us, let us review it, make sure it meets all the guidelines in the Drought Response Act and regulations. And then we'll submit that to you. And then from there, ideally then go before your council or board. There are some things that are required by the legislation. It's not a lot, but a few things, and especially too, we can help maybe with things that we've seen water systems struggle with and recognize that that didn't work for them. Before you put forth something to your council and then have to come back to us and get, because we hear from a lot of cities and towns, you know, it takes several readings or a process with them going before their county councils. So again, if we could just help in the beginning. Yes.
Okay, other things in chapter 8 that we want to touch, if there's any drought response initiatives, and I'll give some examples of those from other basins, then we want to develop those. We want to list recommendations on drought management strategies, and then we want to include a communication plan. So those 4 things is what we want to include in chapter 8. And the other basins, chapter 8 is a pretty short chapter. It's only 8, 9, 10 pages, but we're going to walk through development of that today. Again, just for a refresher, there's a drought response committee. Those are the members there, and I think that may be, yeah, that's a little bit out of date. I think I pointed that out before. Like Sam Kinnery represents Department of Agriculture, Quinny, excuse me. There's a drought planning guidebook.
We go back.
Yeah, yeah.
So more background, because it's new to me. So there's a committee that's doing this now, right? Could we get more detail on who's on that committee, where they're located, how the process works? And then my question would be, why are we doing the same thing? Isn't that committee already done that? Where's the overlap? I mean, it just seems to me that that process is in place. And I get the emails from y'all to show me South Carolina, you know, DNR or whoever sends them. You know, here's the status of the drought response, you know, where we are, and some, you know, the color changes after Debbie. That's why I asked the question easier. But I just like the background of what is the process now, and then what are we expected to do is going to be different than what that existing committee does.
Right.
And why are there 2 efforts?
Yeah, I think the framework envisioned the RBC supporting the DMAs and the DRC, but Hope, do you want to speak to just overall purpose of the DRC and how the DMAs are organized and how they feed into the DRC?
Sure, yes. I mean, would we have time for a couple of just slides that might make it easier to discuss, or I could just try to talk through it? So whatever you want. I mean,
Yeah, why don't you start talking and I'll
okay,
blow them up.
yeah.
Yeah.
It should be, sorry, I was racing to get here. Yeah, Dean.
Hope it might be helpful to kind of also describe how do you measure when we're in drought? What are the variables that are measured and to say we're in this drought or that drought, or
Right, and it's on here. And you may recall, believe, and they kind of running together with the RBCs, but I believe we gave the talk in January. But it's, at that time, it's probably so new and fresh to everybody that it's hard to wrap your brain around it. Let me see if I got that right there. And we came in and kind of talked about the climate of the basin and this process. And it's this, I'm gonna scoot on down to.
Actually, let me save this down because I pulled out my answer.
Timber on fire is not a good picture.
I know. Well, while he's pulling this up, some of you may be questioning, why do we have still a portion of the state in drought? Well, the upper Savannah did not, they had less than an inch of rain from Debbie. They were dry leading into that, but relatively dry. Not as dry as other parts of the state, but because of the no rainfall from Debbie, and then less than an inch of rain since Debbie, most of the indicators, stream flow, which we're going to talk about, stream flow, concern over forest fires, and then of course impacts to agriculture. There was support to increase the level of drought for the counties from all of the counties here, all the way down to Edgefield, went to model. Again, I mentioned Aiken is incipient. But this is the look at the drought management areas. The only two counties that did stay in incipient and were close, they were considering being upgraded to moderate, were these two. Again, everything else is out of drought. I just wanted to mention and make sure I clarified that it was because they didn't get any rain from Debbie, basically. But so just quick background. You know, the drought response program, we were one of the first in the country, established in 1985 through legislation. The legislation was updated in the year 2000, both the act as well as the supporting regulations. Some of the changes in 2000 was to realign our drought management areas. They used to be by climate division. We felt like it would make more sense to have those by basically as close as we could align them to river basins for the management. Again, DNR is the coordinating agency, but we have our statewide members, forestry, ag, health, Department of DES, need to change that, and DNR. And then we have 12 members that represent water utilities, regional council of governments, power generation facilities, soil and water conservation districts for each of the drought management areas. It's a large committee. That would be 48 members at the local level, 12 for each drought management area, and then the 5 state agencies. The drought response committee members are appointed by the governor. What we've been trying to do is recruit. You might want to tell me how my call to you shortly after the August 1st meeting was, hey, any chance we could convince you, recruit you,
Twisted my arm.
beg you to consider serving on the West Drought Management Area. So when we have a vacancy that comes up, we look to see if any of the River Basin Council members would fit any of these seats, if they're willing to serve. But another requirement is we can't have more than 2 per count. And you can see there, yeah, it's 12, but I mean, 1 from a CPW, 1 from a public service district. So here with a county, we try to find it if there's a county water system. Sometimes, like right now, it's been hard to find those, so we may find a planner. It may be in the central, we have a county representative that actually sits on the town council. So just depends who that person is or where we have, again, a vacancy that's coming available. But you can see in the West, we have quite a few members that are on the drought response committee that also serve on an RBC. Some in the upstate, some in the upper part of the basin, and again, trying to recruit some in the lower part of the basin. Brian, for instance, serves on the committee. So that's been our strategy. Here's a look at the southern. We still have a couple of vacancies here. They have to come from those counties. This is our smallest drought management area, smallest basin.
So, I mean, that's useful, but I guess my question is, what is the charter of the drought management committee and how does it overlap what we're doing? Is there a work product you've already done that we can use? Just seems like you got one committee, you got another committee. We're doing what that's been doing a long time, and it seems like it's a lot of duplication. Why do we have 2 going on at the same time?
Well, and I know I'm gonna let you guys answer, I'll let you answer the process for how you feel like you're going to, how the river basins are contributing this, and it has varied by River Basin Council. But so the Drought Response Committee's purpose is to evaluate the drought conditions based on a set of designated indicators and then make a declaration that best represents the overall drought condition in the drought management area. So here's a look at some of the indicators, the primary indicators that are designated through legislation. So I mean, that's a set of indicators that we have to look at and make a decision, and it's challenging. Like this summer, for instance, it was definitely a severe drought in many parts of the state based on agriculture. It was not a severe drought for our water systems. The committee did at that time, and it was the first time they'd ever jumped that many levels. It wasn't so much for this basin, but for the other basins, particularly the PD basin. Because so that's a look at the indicators. And just a quick, I'm hoping this is going to explain the process. So we have the 4 levels of drought. Just an idea of what we're starting to see when we would make a decision, the committee would make a decision to go to incipient, moderate, severe, and extreme. You know, by moderate, water levels are decreasing, crops and plants are withering, irrigation increases. So the SCDNR, State Climate Office, DRC monitors conditions, shares information, and makes recommendations to manage drought. State and federal agencies, water utilities, and reservoir managers are also monitoring conditions. At incipient, water utilities are expected to review their drought plans. At moderate, severe, and extreme, the committee is asking water utilities to implement their drought plans and ordinances as needed. The DRC may recommend voluntary or mandatory water restrictions. I've seen it rarely that the committee actually asks the state to consider mandatory restrictions. I've never seen the committee in my 30 years actually request mandatory restrictions. As drought conditions and impacts become more severe and response actions increase accordingly, that's just some of the actions that could occur. State agencies increase monitoring. Citizens may see local notices for burn bans. Those burn bans would come from the Forestry Commission. You can see boat ramp closings, water use restrictions. The governor may request voluntary or mandatory conservation, assist with managing impacts, including requesting disaster declarations by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and activating the National Guard to assist with wildfire suppression if needed. That's just an idea of what could potentially happen. So really, to me, a lot of the process with the Drought Response Committee, the committee does have the authority based on the Drought Response Act to go over and beyond and request something that's for an area, a basin of the state. To me, that'll be a challenge to go in and ask. We can see it happening for voluntary restrictions, but to go in and ask for a particular industry or particular sector to mandatory cut out water, that probably won't happen. They have the authority to do that. But to me, what will happen is the process, they will go through this process, closely monitor conditions, and then they will make recommendations through the governor for he or she to utilize their executive authority to request for mandatory restrictions. Now, that's a long ways down the road. Like we've got significant issues with water quality, water supply, potentially a tremendous amount of wildfires burning in the state, air quality conditions. So there would be a lot going on when and if that ever happens. But the fact that we do have this process in place is, to me, what's important of what's already established and working. We do at the point that it exceeds what's designated by the committee's authority. There is a section in our state emergency operations plan for drought that would then kick in when we have reached that emergency status. I don't know how much more you want me to keep going with this and whether I'm exactly.
This is my question. I think my comment would be, I'm not a big believer in duplicating things and coming up with our own things, because if their criteria are already set, John, I think as we go through this and create our chapter, it ought to be in accordance with and guidance of this that's existed since we're new. We shouldn't, because we could create our own thing, not knowing about this, but they already have certain triggers that do certain things.
Right.
That's a statewide process, so I read through some of the things we're looking at, they're pretty similar. To some degree.
Yeah, so again, the RBCs were not intended to be the decision-making body. The responsibility of the DRC and the DMAs is to decide what counties are in what level of drought. You're not responsible for that. You just provide information to help make that decision. I think that's the key distinction. But you're right, there is potentially some overlap, and that's what we need to hone out. And some of the recommendations the other RBCs have developed kind of speak to that a little bit. So we'll work through it.
Which you're helping us in so many ways, and I'll mention a couple of those if I can.
Well, yeah, just like what John was saying, we at our last meeting here, John talked a little bit about Scott Willett's proposal in the upper basin, and of using the DRC, using the RBCs as the DRCs, in that this is
As the
fully
DMAs,
staffed, as the DMAs,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. This is fully staffed, fully has all the reps on it. The reps of these RBCs are hitting all those same areas as what you're showing in the DMAs. And then if we're being asked to develop strategies, well, we have ag at the table and we have the utilities and municipalities at the table. Why not? I think like maybe Ken's question there, that was just an idea of, is there a way to, and I get it, maybe that's a statute change or something like that, but that doesn't mean something's insurmountable. The
Plus hearing
statutes
Hope
change.
talk about what the legislation requires the data must look at. They're set up to have all those indices and look at them, and we're not, that's what they do. They get together, they look at all those indices and review them. And what we talked about especially with Brad here, kind of the local impacts that maybe those indices aren't necessarily communicating, but like when ag sees it before others, if we could be a communicator of just kind of local.
And it will require legislative change, and I'm not saying, and that's why the value of the RBC has been so beneficial at the state program as well as for our local drought response committee. But we would have to change the legislation. There will be some challenges, there would be some opposition. What I do like about the RBC members is you've been trained, your basin. That's not always the case for our current drought response committee members. Even those that have served for years, they may not truly understand the hydrology of the upper and lower basin. Many of them do, because a lot of our committee members have been on there for years. But my one concern is changing the legislation, even though there's several other things that need to be changed in the legislation. I can tell you that in some of these that, again, if anybody wants to talk to me offline, what I worry about is pardon the pun, the legislation getting even more watered down if we open it up. But I know, again, some other things that need to be addressed that I wouldn't say we've put off, but we sort of have to wait on this river basin process to play out before we go back into that legislation and start doing, just because of the concern over it actually getting weakened versus improved.
I think that's probably where Scott's proposal was kind of coming from. Like, you're taking the time to train this group and have this group get so much information and be a part of strategy making. And then maybe that is a nice kind of action thing to come out of it is, hey, we can streamline some statute stuff and be more effective. I think that's what.
That
And I think
consistent
it made
with
all sense.
with what his idea was, yeah.
And but what so far for us, especially if you've gone through this process of evaluating the drought response plans in the basin, and also looking at where is there going to be a problem? I mean, there's been such in-depth analysis performed by the different river basin councils that has helped give us the drought response committee some information on what we may be looking at 10 years from now, 20 years from now. That didn't exist before this RBC process started. And then again, most of the RBCs have also encouraged water systems to update their drought response plans.
Yes, it's a consistent recommendation on all the RBCs, just to encourage the update of the plan.
So we've been beating sort of that dead horse of begging water systems to update it, but then now they're hearing it from the experts in their basin requesting that they consider updating their plans, because again, many of them are 20 years outdated.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Well, quick question for you. How does weather, time of year, those factors play into these decisions? Time of year is a huge variant. And how do they consider whether we're growing stuff or not growing stuff, whether there's a fire risk or not a fire risk when we're setting drought conditions or modifying the drought?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, it'll be, I will say, well, certainly we have had drought response committee meetings every month of the year, probably looking all the way back. But, you may not have as much concern from agriculture when we have a meeting in December. It may be very dry, but at that time, probably then the committee's more closely looking at our water supply and then our concern over forest fires. They still may decide to go to moderate drought based on those two indicators. May not be as heavily weighted on concern from our agricultural community.
So it's sort of in the weighting then of the criteria, and how they address the time of year.
And it's not always, because it would be impossible to always have a convergence of the evidence. We could talk more about the U.S. Drought Monitor because it is tied to funding for our agricultural community. But for this, it's not always a convergence of the evidence, but we do have to have support from the indicators. It can't just be, oh, it's been dry for 6 weeks.
Okay.
And I'm here,
Okay, so one of the first things in chapter 8 we want to address is communication. Answer the question, how do we want to communicate with the rest of the RBC, the public, and the stakeholders? So the other RBCs have the general approach of either having a chair or the vice chair or a designated liaison solicit or receive input from all the RBC members on drought conditions and their responses if they are managing agency that has a response. They feed that information, they compile it, and then they feed that to the DMA in their region. So here either the West DMA or the Southern DMA. There's already existing mechanisms for the DRC and DNR and DES and water utilities to communicate and coordinate their drought response with stakeholders and the public. That's not really what the RBC is envisioned to do, is send information back to stakeholders and the public. I think the thought was intended for you to provide information up the chain to help the DMA and the DRC make decisions. So that's just the general approach. So each RBC has said, yeah, that makes sense. Let's have the chair or the vice chair or a liaison during drought times, help collect and compile information and be that one source of information up to the DMAs.
But how? How?
How?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, this is so generic. It doesn't make a lot of sense. The RBC, because this is a subset of our basin by interest category, but how are we going to update the DMA on drought conditions within this basin? Because we're not communicating to the public at all. That's their job. I just don't see how practically we can have an impact on a process into what we just saw. And we can make recommendations on paper and stuff, but you're talking about now an action. We're now in 2 months into a drought. What does this committee do and how does it work and what metrics are we looking at? Do we have an emergency meeting on drought or how? I mean, it just seems like it's now an action thing where we're a review board with recommendations. So I'm kind of at a disconnect to how this all would work.
So how it may work is that say Carrie was the liaison, or as the chair, she was responsible for it. You might be getting into drought conditions where it hasn't rained for 3 or 4 weeks, and there's starting to be some impacts, maybe on ag, or maybe even some impacts on utilities. maybe Carrie would send out an email that says, hey, RBC members, we're starting to see impacts to our system. Anybody else have any impacts that they want to report to me that I can report up to the DMAs? So she's just soliciting information from all of you that touch water in some way that she can provide to the DMAs.
So it just doesn't seem like it seems like a random sample, not an indicator, not any conclusion or quantitative data that would generate this is a very small subset of all the water districts and water flow within the basin, right? It's kind of a random subset.
Yeah, but you have to remember too, that Hope's group, supported by DES, they're looking at all those different indicators, the 8 or 10 different indicators that are the metrics, stream flows,
KBDI, Palmer Drought Severity Index, US Drought Monitor, groundwater.
yeah, so those are the actual metrics they're tracking all the time, and they're looking at that stuff statewide. So they're really into the weeds. This group is more kind of anecdotal information. How is it impacting users? Or, maybe you have observations from, a stream that goes by your farm, that's, hey, this is dry. It's not usually dry this time of year. She passes that along.
Why am I not seeing any change in drought when I have no water?
Right, well, I have no water. Usually I've got, 30 CFS in my stream this time of year. I've got nothing now and I'm concerned, so she might pass that along. And, that's the type of information that's not always available by looking at the data. Because there's no gauge on that stream. Maybe.
Would it be, like right now, although we're not in drought, for the drought monitoring, we've had to turn irrigation back on since Divvy. Would that be information also?
Yeah, certainly. Water utilities aren't struggling with water, but if it hasn't rained since Debbie, because you got all that rain at once, that doesn't help you much. Your soil moisture dropped back down and you're at a peak time where you want to increase your yield and get the water on the plants, then you're needing to water a lot more than you typically may need to. So that's important.
And we even have a condition monitoring tool that's out there that we don't have to wait till this is fully established. But this condition monitoring tool is what we look at daily, and especially right before our committee meetings. And it shows up on a map where you can enter those impacts.
And we're going to talk about that in a minute too. Yeah. Sorry, Dean, I skipped over.
That's okay, because you're answering the question I had, which is, what is the motivation? Is there any motivation when you say that the RBC chair, vice chair doesn't solicits input? It's really it's not tied to a declaration by the drought committee. It's basically a perception of the water users involved that there is something happening here that we need to be conscious of and determine if there's a need for action.
Yes.
It's not an official, oh, they made a designation, we're gonna find out what's going on. And if she feels, as she said, the water levels have dropped, and I don't understand, that's the motivation. I'm just trying to establish what the motivation is for that initial first action. Solicits input from RBC. What motivates that?
Right. It's just leveraging the power of the DRC to help, of the RBCs to help support the DMAs and their support of the DRC. Just a way to get more information together.
It just seems to me there ought to be some, like you have indicators that you measure that trigger this. Then within our basin, there should be some indicators of stream flows, groundwater, retention, ag input that would then trigger something official, not just, hey, my stream's dry. That to me, just doesn't, I'm an engineer, it just doesn't, it's touchy feely kind of stuff, you think. Because we're a random sample of the basin, right? We don't have every utility here, we don't have every farmer here.
Yeah.
We have a few people, and it just seems like if we're gonna do something like that, it ought to be based on some factors of.
So a good example of what you're talking about is a response strategy where you're setting a specific metric or measure, and that triggers some actions. And this example that the Edisto RBC developed, this low flow management strategy, is a good example of that. I don't remember if I touched on this last time, but they were concerned about leaving enough water in the Edisto River down at the bottom of the basin after all the different uses upstream during low flow times. Charleston Water was the particular one that brought this up because they're withdrawing water down near the bottom of the basin. And they wanted to make sure they don't take all the remaining water out and leave nothing flowing in the Edisto from Gibbons Ferry down to the coast. So they talked about this strategy when flows get low, and they develop ranges, specific ranges, then that would trigger reductions in surface water withdrawals in the whole basin by the 6 or 7 largest surface water users. So they developed specific metrics and then a specific response strategy. But there was a goal in mind to keep enough flow in the Edisto River for Charleston and for everything downstream. So they basically didn't dry up the river. That's one.
Does that then get memorialized in a MOU amongst all those water users, legislation? How does that become implemented?
Yeah, so it's still voluntary.
Okay.
But I think 6 of the 7 largest users were on the RBC that would be impacted by this, including ag and Dominion. But Dominion already has a plan where they can go back and forth between groundwater and surface water, depending on conditions. Charleston, the only one that wasn't part of the RBC process was Titan Farms, and they're way up in the top of the basin. They've got a lot of different withdrawal points, both groundwater and surface water. But generally, there was consensus behind this, and it got memorialized in the plan, but it's voluntary.
Just, I mean, I've been involved in many intergovernmental service multi-agency. It just seems to me that you could just tie something like that in MOU. And it is voluntary, but it's a memorandum of understanding that carries more weight than just a plan that's over here and then something happens and then somebody's got to say, well, this plan,
Sure.
you know, I mean, just
Yeah.
it make more sense.
Yep. That's a possibility. We didn't discuss that as part of this effort, but yeah. Okay, let's go back to the communication plan. Any other thoughts or questions about this? I kept it pretty simple in the other basins.
My
Yeah.
question would be, just because you use my name as an example, I'm sitting here thinking, I'm in the water utility sector and I may not know to solicit that input if I'm not in the ag and she's over there seeing a stream. So is there some, I don't want it to just be up to one person to reach out, like there needs to be an understanding that.
Yeah.
You know, if I haven't sent out an email to say, hey, what's going on, if something's going on, it has to be, you know, communicate. So
Right.
that right there implies that it's up to me. I'm using myself as an example, you know, to ask.
There's got to be a protocol.
Yeah.
Established.
So we didn't get into a lot of details about how that protocol would work. We kept it pretty open. It's up to the RBC, whether they want to establish like a working drought subgroup that, you know, meets regularly and says, anybody have any problems? No? Okay, done. Or that would be called based on, you know, drought conditions being observed by other RBC members. And maybe you just have an open,
So it's not spelled out in their plan how they would do it.
not really, no. If you want to spell it out, you can, but they all are comfortable leaving it, you know, fairly general.
Well, I think as a minimum, Carrie ought to be on the, whatever the other acronym is.
EMA.
Yeah, so she's on the phone calls to know.
But we already have someone on there. Maybe just
I
someone who's.
you're the chairman though that's designated, so unless you guys are talking a lot, because that person on that council is gonna know, you know, on these monthly or whatever calls are, that what's happening.
Yeah.
And you could then go out and solicit other things.
Well, I mean, Lynn will be on the EMA.
Okay.
Yeah, literally. So maybe when there's going to be a meeting, they communicate with me
Brian's already on it.
and
so-
solicit, then I solicit input so that you could take the information to the meeting, right? You would have input from the RBC at your meeting, right?
Yeah, I mean, conceivably, the state drought spots ought to have a protocol where they reach out to the drought management, to the RBC members in the drought management area, select farmers, municipalities, and say, this is, the books say this is happening. What are your experiences right now? What are you seeing right now?
Right. So it'd be initiated by that or DRC.
By the state.
The only concern I have being with that is because even for myself, who I feel like is close to trying to understand a basin, I don't really know what, until I get those presentations from Scott, from Daryl with Forestry Commission, I don't always have a pulse on what exactly is going on to know how to reach out to or from Department of Ag until the actual meeting where we discuss that for 2 hours.
Oh,
But then how would you ever get input from an RBC through that flow thing that would be meaningful to that meeting?
You could send that to us before the meeting that we would have, like, we hear from a good many farmers before a meeting. We hear from some water utilities individually or via DES, but then you would be on the call.
remind us how meetings are called.
Yeah, so they're as needed, but we are trying to establish, and they're conference call, not in person. We are gonna have a tabletop exercise next spring, which I'm hoping to get the RBCs tremendously plugged into that. But right now, they're as needed. However, we're trying to set the schedule 2 months in advance. So right now, we have a date for September 25th and November 5th for the next 2 meetings. So that has not always happened where we try to set the meetings 2 months in advance. But say it starts to rain and we don't anticipate any meetings after November, it might not be scheduled.
So as needed is what's the criteria that determines the need for a meeting?
To start the process, the state climatology office will initiate and give at least 2 weeks notice to the drought response committee. But we also certainly welcome when maybe we're not picking up on a bullseye or a ground zero that's happening in Hampton and Jasper and the lower part of the West Drought Management Area. Contact us and say, we need a meeting.
So I think that's the idea, right? We could be a.
And we think probably what will end up happening is we get more of the RBCs involved and we'll continue to work through this. We're hopefully going to, in 2025, just try to find a time, like the first Wednesday of every month. And just, we know from January to December, we're going to have the first Wednesday of every month. And my thoughts is if it's raining buckets and we don't really have a drought, that we will utilize that time for training. Is my proposal for 2025, but I have to get the buy-in of the committee that they'd be like, yes, we agreed to get on that call and have training or make sure we're not missing anything.
Okay, well, we go back to this. Are you generally okay with this broad approach? There's not a lot of specifics here, but do you want to develop specifics on how you communicate? Is there anything about this you don't like? This is working within the existing framework.
I like the fact that you have a liaison. If we already have 2 people on,
Yeah.
then we automatically have a liaison. So
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be the chair.
Right,
Vice
right.
chair.
I
If you have a
agree.
liaison as a word.
Is there a guarantee that when you roll off or you roll out, that there is somebody from the RBC? Is there an opportunity to create a seat?
I hope trying to make that happen.
Someone got a seat for the RBC right now. Right. But we're just, because we wanted to make it so that it was more than one seat. Sure. Because if one seat, it'd be one, but this way we're trying to plug in, and ideally, we would try to find different sectors, somebody that's an ag representative.
That could be a future legislation change because as you said, the RBCs didn't exist when they established the criteria, so.
Yeah, the only issue, the process,
be a
is fine,
recommendation.
the question is, what would trigger this to happen? What's the triggering event of the box on the left?
Issues.
Yeah,
Just
what-
anecdotal
what-
issues.
No, what does it? Somebody makes a phone call, I just don't know what would trigger this whole process.
Yeah, I think it's just somebody making an observation that, hey, we're slipping into drought based on what I observed, stream flow, soil moisture, ponds dry, my well's starting to sputter, I don't know. And then that person reaches out to the liaison that may solicit in a RBC wide email. Anybody else have any issues to report? So it's kind of a organic
We
trigger.
can't monitor every stream in the state.
Yeah.
I know you want data, but
But the drought committee, Hope mentioned that tool where anybody can submit that anecdotal scenario.
Right, the condition monitoring observer report.
Right, so if we do this process, this group is essentially circumventing that. would y'all prefer folks just submit it through that? And that way you have all those things in one spot, the map and the system.
In an ideal situation, it would be both, in my opinion, to have that personal representative that's, we know is gonna be on the call. And then also the Seymour condition monitoring tool, because not only is it used for the state declaration, it can also be utilized for our US drought monitor declaration. That's the national map, which does get funding for some of our farms. Now, I just throw out one thing to just really complicate this. So Brian, when you're on that call and you're representing, you are designated to represent special purpose districts. So he's representing special purpose districts. And this committee comes to you and says, you know, it's really dry and we want you to push for moderate drought because of X, Y, and Z. Would that be a concern for you, who someone is representing water systems? And that, how would that be handled? Where you're gonna say, well, based on water systems, we are not in a moderate drought because we got plenty of water. But based on my RBC hat, they really feel like you should be in moderate drought for Beaufort, Jasper, and Hampton. Those are kind of in the weeds that. Whereas if he's representing special purpose district, if you're on there and you're on those calls right now, and you're not an RBC seat, but you're important to our process, then you can speak for the RBC.
But I'm not technically a member.
But you're not, but we absolutely value the what we call our invited participants.
Okay.
Sounds right. I mean, not to keep lobbying, but I think that this discussion really, to me, it kind of does underscore like what Scott Willett was saying. You know, we're doing this already. Simplicity is the best way to get an ordered result instead of, well, let's layer more liaisons and more committee and more, you know.
Yeah, that was his point.
Did they write that into their plan?
Yes, that's going to be, and we'll get, I mean,
Okay. So they generally had that same.
this is what they said. They want that written into their plan. They all agreed with it. They realize it requires a change in the Drought Response Act, but they thought it made the most sense after having the very similar discussion that you've had.
Right.
Other RBCs though, like the Saluda RBC, they didn't feel the same way. Said, nah, we're good. Let's just do this. Keep things the way they are and do this.
And that was the way the editor did as well, right?
Yeah. And the Broad and PD, they didn't suggest kind of changes to the act to allow for the RBCs to be that DMA. So, I mean, maybe that's the question. Do you want to just kind of do what most of the RBCs did and kind of have a general communication protocol as described here? Or do you feel like the Upper Savannah's recommendation makes more sense?
Question. What's the designated life of an RBC?
Yeah.
That's really the issue.
Yeah.
If this is only a 3-year thing, then we can.
Yeah.
If it's gonna be a continuing group, it can't.
So I think that's to be determined, but the thought was when the planning framework was developed and PPAC member, like Dean, tell me differently if you agree, but the thought was that the RBCs would do these plans after 2 years and then continue to meet, continue to update them as needed and as funding allowed. Similar to what Georgia does. They've continued to meet and produced 2 different updates from their original plan. So they've been meeting since 2008 or 10 or so.
Well, I think we need to know the answer to the question before we can come.
Yeah, I don't.
With that recommendation.
Yeah, I think it was certainly conceived of, that these, organizations would be permanent. And that they would be, the membership would change over time as time went on, but the organization itself would be permanent. That was created and understood before the reorganization of state government. So the issue is, does that reorganization, does the Department of Environmental Services commit to effectively maintaining these organizations over time, which means getting money in the budget to basically support them, to pay for more people like you to keep keep these committee meetings rolling and keeping discussions going and modifying and updating all these things that you would want to have done. If we can't guarantee ourselves that, it seems to me changing the structure as proposed by the Upper Savannah folks may not be the best. That's my perspective.
John, we have a standing request in to Senator Tom Young to speak to this group.
Yeah.
This would be a perfect question for Senator Young to address what was involved in the formation of this group, at least all of these groups. What were the pressing points, the issues, and then the duration? How long would the General Assembly expect these groups to remain in place through funding mechanisms and inputs and so forth? Just seems to me, and he's given us the yes, but, and we haven't been able to schedule him.
Yeah, I think last time we spoke with him was in the spring and he said the fall would be a good time, which is quickly approaching. So we can reach out to him again and see if he'd be interested in speaking in November. We're gonna go on a field trip in October. If the RBC would like that. Okay. Okay, so Dean suggested that, maybe what the Upper Savannah recommended is not the way to go, given the uncertainties of whether the RBCs will be meeting and viable
Yeah,
2, 3, 4 years from now.
I guess what I'm saying is, to me, that's a decision we don't need to make today.
Right. I agree.
That we should kind of see where we go here. DES is just starting the management of this process.
Yep.
I would suggest we give them an opportunity to refine it to the point that they're comfortable with it. And once we get to that point, then I think that's time to make that decision.
Could we maybe do a little of both? Have a general approach, but then acknowledge in our plan this future need to, I guess,
Say-
solidify the RBC's presence in the DMA
We
sometime.
could write it up that way, yeah.
Something that acknowledges.
So basically say if the RBCs continue to meet as a planning body, then we think this approach may make sense and you might want to consider that and changes to the act that would allow that type of thing.
To avoid duplicity.
Yeah.
Duplication.
Or at least have a seat. Yeah.
A seat, yeah.
What were you gonna say?
Yeah, no, I mean, just, because you'll have to understand there, and I'm open for whatever, because I think there will be some benefits to this as well. This process as well, that, that for those drought response committee members that have been serving for 10 or 15 years, and what will happen to them when they try to be incorporated into the river basin? So that you don't.
Are you talking about the DMA or?
Yes,
or the
yeah,
DRC?
the committee members, the DRC committee members, that if you change this, right, and they've been serving.
So let me make it clear. Scott was recommending the RBCs act as the DMAs, not the DRC. And you're talking about the DRC committee members now.
But DRC committee members, for instance, all those that are on the west, like we're trying to get, like Brian on the west. So you're going to completely replace those members. Those are DRC members.
Okay, I guess I didn't understand correctly then the
Like
setup.
all of those are DRC.
Okay, I thought all those are DMA members representing each area and they report to those 5 DRC members.
Yeah, but the DRC, those 5 state agency members, we can't act alone. We can't act in isolation without.
Yeah.
So, but each one of those, I mean, the drought response committee consists of the state members as well as, you're calling them DMA members.
Yeah,
We just look at them as drought response committee.
I see, okay.
Representing the West. And so the 5 state agencies serve with the 12 on the West, the 5 state agency members serve with the 12 in the Central.
I got it, okay,
So that's what I would call them, they're all DRC.
okay.
So if you replace DRC,
How come the DMAs don't line up with the RBCs? Why are there different areas? Because we have us overlaid.
Yeah, the RBCs didn't exist.
It didn't exist when that legislation was created.
And the
No, I get it, but why?
RBCs are hydrologic.
right,
The RBCs are based upon river basins design. They're geographic river basins. The drought response committee members are political. Basically, they are tied to county boundaries. So that's the other thing you have to deal with. If you've got a drought response that's going to happen in half of a county,
yep,
Right.
then because that's the way that's the way we're organized.
Right.
And take a look at it. I mean, it's,
Yeah, half and half here and here.
So you're asking for, yeah, right, exactly.
that's why I think we just put this one aside for a little while and
It sounds like just having the legislation say an RBC member needs to be on the DMA. Is the way that you have your liaison, you have your, and when the meeting's called, that RBC member can reach out to the RBC, get the input. Seems pretty straightforward to me.
Yeah,
But,
okay, I want to move on. So you've given us a lot of good thoughts. And again, this is a fairly short chapter. We can revisit this. We can revisit this in a couple months if we learn anything more about the future of RBCs. I don't want to overthink this part either. So what we'll probably do is draft up something for you to review in a couple months, but then we'll revisit it. We'll keep a limit to the discussion because I don't want to overfill this. And then we'll move on. But
Yeah.
I like everything that you've talked about. There's some good ideas here. It's just, I think, putting it in paper and getting you all to react to it and agree to it is what we need to do. Okay, let's move on to talking about drought management response strategies. So I gave you one example already of the Edisto Basin's drought response strategy. That makes sense to everybody?
It does, but my question is this codified in some way?
It's
someplace?
voluntary and
I brought
it's just
that
in the
up.
plan, right?
So
So
it should be an MOU amongst the joint agencies where they sign it all
And at least promulgated,
Right.
in some fashion.
It should be.
It seems to me.
See, there's so much more surface water withdrawals in the Edisto is much more than there are in our area. So
Yeah.
this one to me doesn't
Yeah.
fit us.
I completely agree. Most of the other basins, look at what the Edisto did, and they said, that's great, that works for
Yeah.
them, but we don't have that situation here. So they said, fine, but we don't need any initiatives. A lot of basins already have something going on, like the Catawba. You know, it's North and South Carolina. It's 11 reservoirs managed by Duke Energy. And there's a lot of public water supply use there too. So they already have a low inflow protocol, which is very similar to this low flow management strategy. They've got different stages that get triggered by water levels and flows. And then they have goals at each stage where public water suppliers are intended to do demand reductions and meet those goals.
Doesn't the Corps have that already for this event?
And well, I'm getting to that. So then in the Savannah, we've got something similar, a low inflow protocol. Duke has it for the QE Toxaway system. And then the Corps has it for the Savannah Basin, different trigger levels. So they're all very similar and they're all intended to address low flow conditions and make sure there's adequate water for all uses to the extent possible. So you've already got that in the Savannah. I don't suggest you doing anything new or different that's different than that because it's already there. You know, there's already controlled releases from Thurman where they release minimum flows to the lower part of the Savannah. On the Salkehatchie, there's really very little surface water use.
Yeah.
It's just ag.
yeah, and there's only less than one hand of permitted surface water withdrawal. In other words, not the agricultural withdrawal, which are registered,
Right.
but actual permitted.
Right.
And so we may only be talking about 2 or 3 entities that would be subject to some kind of protocol.
Right. So unlike the Edisto, I don't see a lot of reason why you would really want a specific response strategy in either the Salkehatchie or the lower Savannah, because there's already stuff in place for the lower Savannah, the whole Savannah. And the Salkehatchie, I'm not sure that really makes sense given the existing uses and the nature of the system already.
Okay, throw a monkey wrench at it.
Yeah.
And some ag user comes in somewhere along the Salkehatchie and start pulling a lot of water out of it.
Right.
And
Right. The downstream registered users then don't have any water. And I think Brad actually mentioned that last time as a potential concern. Or JJ, well, yeah, JJ was mentioned in terms of leaving water for ecology.
Right, because we've had times of fish kills in the Salkehatchie because there's no water, but we're not in drought.
Right, and it's not necessarily related to upstream withdrawals, and it could be impacted by it, but I think the instance he showed was just there was really no water there regardless. But upstream withdrawals could exacerbate it certainly, extend the period when there's not enough water and lower DO and that type of thing. So that is a concern. But do you develop a response strategy around that? I mean, again, it would be voluntary because it would apply only to registered users and, you know, when it's dry, that's when farmers need the water. So, you know, what the EDISO pushed for was resiliency, and their low flow strategy was based on the ability for those 6 or 7 largest users to switch over to groundwater primarily. Dominion's a good example. They have the ability to use EDISO water or groundwater to pretty much meet all of your demand, I think. Right?
Working towards it.
Working
Yeah.
towards it, yeah. And I think Jeremy Walther, Walther Farms has increased his ability to use groundwater. Before he could meet 20% of his peak demands, but I thought Joey Oswald was telling me that he's worked with them to install additional wells and or sprinklers connected to his well to be able to water more than 20% of his peak demand.
Does that depend on which crop they're growing that year?
I'm sure it does, yeah.
Because I think it varies dramatically based on the capacity and then what they're growing. So
Right.
when they're growing the potatoes, it takes a lot more water than when they're growing beans. So,
Yeah, well, and there's quality issues too. Groundwater and surface water have different qualities, and you know, he can't easily switch over to groundwater and get the same yield that he can from surface water for some reason or another that I don't understand, but that was certainly the case. But my point being that the EDISO recommended conjunctive use, basically, the ability to switch back and forth between groundwater and surface water. So, I mean, maybe that's, you know, something you want to recommend in the instance where in the Salkehatchie, you know, one upstream user may take up all the water, and then the 3 farms downstream that rely on that same stream don't have any. They could switch over to groundwater, or maybe they could have an agreement with the upstream farmer that he uses half groundwater, half surface water. I'm just kind of making this up, but that would be the kind of strategy you'd have to discuss and talk about.
So ultimately, what that would imply for us is that the creation of agreements between the 4 users could be something that we would be in this environment coming forward with.
Right.
To say that you guys need to work as a team here on this very limited resource. Right, and manage those things together. You're not gonna be regulated. You've got to work a deal so that the person that needs it most at that particular time gets to use it.
Yeah. So, and the benefit of you all putting it in your plan, even though it's just a voluntary plan without, you know, any memorandum of agreement or anything, is that it might help funding, right? You know, so you might be able to take this plan, farmers might be able to take this plan to the NRCS and say, look, you know, they've identified the fact that we may have shortages of water and downstream users might not have availability if an upstream user is using all of it. Can you help us fund additional groundwater wells or more storage, you know, more impoundments so that we can have more resiliency? I think that's what the value of you putting something like that in your plan is. So that's more of a discussion when we get to discussion of water management strategy. It's not necessarily what we're talking about right now, which is drought response. So we'll talk about that more, actually, starting the next meeting when we begin discussing water management strategies. Let me go back to this then. Do you all think there's any need to develop a drought response strategy in either basin?
Question. Within the West, are there key indicators that the drought response committee looks at that they can share with us, and then where we go in the other basin, just as information so that we could look at that, see if there's anything in there that might trigger something for us.
Oh. I'm assuming you look at all of them, right?
Yes, I mean, as far as you, each month, each week, is that what you're talking about?
So if you look, bring up the map of the DMAs. Right. So within our River Basin Council goes over 2 DMAs. Yeah. And within that territory, you're looking at key indicators to determine whether you should declare something happen, right? So could you share with us, not today, but in the future, what key indicators in that yellow line you're looking at that might give us some input or something to consider in answering your question?
Now there's a website called scdrought.com. And the indicators are all listed there, plus many more. So those are updated as the indicators are updated. Some are updated weekly, some are updated daily. But that's a lot of information for you to process. What we do with the Drought Response Committee is, because as you know, with rain, if we send it out a week in advance, it wouldn't be accurate to what they're making a decision on. We certainly can add the RBCs to the list, and that the indicators that are considered during the Drought Response Committee meeting are set the day before the committee. So that would reflect what's happening at that moment. So is that what you're thinking you want?
It was just more, I'm an engineer, I'm looking for data, because you're asking the question, do we want to develop any drought management or response strategies? For what?
For when they declare drought.
For what scenario? So I was saying, what information could we get that the response committee is looking at that might help us come up with some of that stuff? But if there are already indicators out there, why reinvent them?
Yeah, no, the only reason you might reinvent something is,
You
again,
guys to come back with us and tell us what those are, we can look at them. Maybe they're useless, maybe it's too much information, I don't know. But I've never been in a situation where there's too much information. Just read through what you want to use and not use versus start from scratch.
Like the list of indicators the state looks at, I could send you our list, and it's
Just within our basic council, not the whole state.
but it's the same indicators. We gotta look at the same indicators in each drought management area for consistency.
But you're using, aren't you looking at certain levels in certain areas within each council?
Sure, the spring flow in our rivers.
Rainfall.
Yeah. So we're gonna look at the Salkehatchie here, we're gonna look at the little PD and the PD here. It's more than that, it's.
No, so it'd be nice within our area to know what those indicators are, if they exist, right? Do we have those?
We can, see drought.com, and we can just show you what the committee looks at. Like, for instance, the US Drought Monitor is one of our indicators. That's updated every Thursday. We provide input on that, but it's one of the indicators, so it dropped this morning. So if you go up to, there's the map for this week, conditions. So if you go down to the US Drought Monitor, the US Drought Monitor is one of the indicators.
oh, click on it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It just seems to me if this whole process is going on, we ought to be looped in, watching it,
This SC drought.
take advantage of it.
So
And
we
any
look at
data
this.
you have, we ought to incorporate in our plan.
But this would be one, and you can see how it's not based on DMAs, it's based on where right now there's a drought. And then there's the crop moisture index, it's actually got problems, the Palmer Drought Severity Index, stream flow, go down to lake levels.
We're not looking to change this. Our plan is saying, how are we as a river basin going to manage our area in response to this data and their declaration?
I get it, but we gotta have a trigger to start something, a process, other than I feel my stream's dry. To me, that's not a trigger for.
The DRC has the trigger. They meet and they declare it. Right?
We're supposed to be providing them feedback in that loop prior to them meeting or during some process of, I'm not sure when, to be honest with you, but if there are indicators they're looking at that we could look at as well, that might trigger a conversation. Hey, these indicators are now in yellow. Is there anything going on out there that we can then feed back in?
Like stream flow, we look at two different triggers for stream flow. This is one that's based on some of the legislative criteria, but then also, if you don't mind going back one more to the USGS map. And this is provided by DES. This is updated, and then there's the Keach Biome Drought Index, so you could look at it. Groundwater levels go down a little ways, a little more, so I can pull up the stream flow. Where is it? Here's all the other indicators. No, this got that. Sorry.
Up or down?
Down. No, I mean, up. Yeah, here we go. So like, there's your precipitation. If you want to look at precipitation for 30 days, 60 days, that's what we show the committee. And then here's some more water resources. There's some more forestry. Why can't I find it and do stream flow? And, the committee typically, because you can look at stream flow real time, you can look at it 14-day, 28-day. So click on this. The committee then looks at, just click anywhere, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, thank you.
And do you have
No,
a
you click
model
on it.
with all this, do you have a model that all this is plugged in,
That's our base.
that then comes up with an outlook forecast and all that?
No,
No.
I mean, there's forecast for, there's not a forecast for any of these indicators. If you just click on the open space. But I mean, it doesn't matter. You can just. Like this is stream flow, so you can see there's the gauges that you would look at for the different drought management areas.
It's going slow. So.
But I mean, those are the indicators that the Drought Response Committee look at when they make their declaration. And it's a complicated process. It can be for sure.
Ken, I don't think the intent is for the RBCs to digest all this information and to be that into the weeds. Again, in the Edistos example, they were trying to solve a particular problem that wasn't being solved by the DRC. They recognized that there was low flow conditions near the bottom of the basin that were exacerbated by everybody withdrawing water during drought times, and they saw that as a problem. So they developed their own triggers and their own response. And that's also been done by the Army Corps and the Catawba Wateree and Duke to manage low flow conditions. So I think the question that we're asking the RBC is, do you think that there's any is there a reason to have a coordinated basin-wide response? Or we're talking about surface water here. And I don't think there is, because there already is one in the Savannah. You're not going to tell the Army Corps really to rewrite their rules.
Yes. Do we only talk about surface water? Do we not have?
Well, we'll talk about groundwater too, but that'll be later.
In terms of drought?
So you don't think there is, and that's kind of where I'm getting to as well. I mean, it doesn't seem to me there is either.
No,
I was just trying to get more data to support that there isn't.
Basically, just to go to follow the
Yeah,
already recommended.
Right. So if the DRC identifies that you're in severe or extreme drought conditions, that triggers local utilities to do some mandatory or potentially voluntary or potentially mandatory demand reductions as the response. So that response is already there. This response that the Edisto came up with was separate. That wasn't already written down in any drought management plan or anything. I don't think for the most part.
No, but there is a role for this RBC in protecting change. And that is just, like you said,
That's the communication.
Yeah,
just a
that's
communication.
using your eyes and ears and the communication. part.
And just, having that in the plan would be sufficient.
Okay. Okay. Again, does that help satisfy
I
your?
agree with your assessment.
Okay. Okay, before we get on to then recommendations, let's take a 10-minute break. And then we'll try to work through the recommendations before lunch. So it's 11:26. Let's meet again start up again about 11:35. 9-minute break.
All right.
Okay, so the next part, we're going to talk about developing drought response recommendations. And the way we've organized this, kind of for sake of efficiency and so you know what the other RBCs did, we're going to walk through the recommendations that were generally adopted, developed and adopted by the other IBCs, but not always. And you'll see at the bottom, if you've already looked at the slides, you can see who's adopted these and who didn't consider them or who considered them but decided not to incorporate them. The first recommendation that was adopted by the Upper Savannah, Saluda, Broad, and PD, but not even considered by the Edisto, which went first, and at that point, we really weren't even talking about drought management plans, is RBC recommends that water utilities review and update their drought management response plans and ordinances every 5 years or more frequently if conditions change. I'm not going to read all of that, but this speaks to what Hope was talking about earlier. There's been a push to ask utilities to revisit their drought plans since they were written typically in 2003, and they haven't been looked at or reviewed or updated in 21 years. Over that time, we've gone through multiple droughts, and ideally they've applied and used their drought plans, and maybe they worked, maybe they didn't. Over that time, a lot of things changed. Things changed simply like contact information. You know, who the contact representative is for the utility. Their source of water might have changed. Where they get their wholesale water or who they sell water to might have changed. There's a lot of easy updates that utilities can do that don't take a lot of time. But I think Hope and Elliot have been encouraging to do a comprehensive look, to follow the guideline document that they sent out. And generally, all the RBCs have said, yes, we think that's just a good recommendation. We want to put it on paper. We want to encourage utilities to update their plans every 5 years or more frequently if conditions change. So what do you all think about that recommendation? Like it?
Yeah.
Lawrence likes it. John likes it.
I'm not sure that every 5 years is feasible. Maybe every 8 to 10 years.
Would you feel better if they just looked at it every 5 years instead of saying review and update? It's just, hey, do we need to change anything? Nope, we're good.
Right.
Done.
I mean, yeah, I agree that I believe we definitely have not looked at them in many years, but no, I don't know necessarily if they need to be updated in 5 years.
Yeah.
If they need to be updated, they need to be updated, definitely.
We've heard the same comment from other RBCs too. The question, you really need to do it every 5 years.
Yeah.
But the second bullet there is really operative for a lot of communities that are growing right now and have started to grow in the last 5 to 8 years. After decades or a long period of flat growth or no growth in these communities. And now they're facing significant residential and commercial. So, this could be a driver to review your plan, if not to make changes to it. The other thing is that municipalities change their sources of water over time.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's a factor in all of this in the equation, even if it's sort of from the same source.
What does that mean, change of the source?
Well, in groundwater, new pumps, new location for your wells. Or in the case of some.
That doesn't change your source of water, though. Your source of water is still groundwater.
It's true. We change the volume that you're using or you can draw upon. And then surface water can be accessed in more than one location. So our municipality draws from Shaw's Creek for surface water. And we're about to build our third different outsource location. It's still the same source of water, but you have to update all your EPA requirements to draw the water from the new location with your brand new plant, which also has a different capacity and efficiency. So it just, to me, it makes prudent sense that the drought plan should be updated as you're updating these other plans.
Works where its conditions change, that's enough. I have a question for Hope. Hope, so the drought committee meets, we're in a red zone, the governor says mandatory water ration. If these plans aren't updated, these plans aren't updated and ordinances aren't updated locally, there's really no way to enforce that, is there?
Well,
If you don't have an ordinance, I mean, what power does the governor have over a water utility?
I would say the government, the executive authority could ask for, could potentially, using those executive authority, I think we would want to check, because that's never happened in 30 years. But what would they exactly be able to do with their executive authority? That's a last resort. We're hoping all of these plans that have been updated before every 20 years are addressing, and they have their own system specific triggers, by the way. We encourage every water system. We don't want this water system to solely use the Drought Response Committee's declaration. It's not one shoe fits all. The Drought Response Committee's declaration should be one trigger out of multiple triggers that each water system has that says now we're in moderate drought, severe drought, extreme. So those will be in place and working as a last absolute resort. We would have to depend on the state's emergency powers. Is that?
Yeah, but then they'd have to be enforced locally, like
And they are.
Hilton Head Island through an ordinance that
Yep.
said the people, this ordinance says you can't do that. If there's no ordinance.
Yeah, they have their ordinances and plans.
But
We
if-
call them
but if
plans.
they're not updated after 20 years old, they may be way out of whack and the ordinances may not be there. So what's prohibiting the state drought committee from sponsoring legislation to have that done?
To make them
Every
update?
7 years, whatever the hell it is. I mean, some other than once. Is there no ordinance that says that if you've got one done 30 years ago, then you don't have to update it ever? No state law.
Unfortunately, that was.
They're not- that's
That was
weird.
an oversight in 2000 that was not specified in the legislation that you have to update every 5 years. Just isn't in the legislation. And our concern and the reason we have not opened up the legislation just for that change seems obvious. Just go in there, open the legislation, add this in there. One, we will get pushback from water systems on that. We will. And then potentially by opening up that legislation, you will help every part of that legislation. And we DNR have felt like we wanted again to see the RBC, all of this work its way out for 5 or 8 to 10 years. We didn't expect it to be quite that long. And then change the legislation, start to finish as needed.
Yeah, but in my experience with legislation, I've done it in many states, it's just, you don't open it up and just say this bill, this adds these words to this sentence in that statute, yes or no?
It's an amendment, what you're talking.
Yeah, you're just amending, you're just changing, you're just adding 5 words and need to be updated every 5 years. Period. Some guy sponsors it and then it's voted on. I mean, it seems like.
Oh, if it only worked that way
Yeah,
in this state.
in this state.
Thank you.
So there is no such
There is,
process. in the state.
you open that door and you can't tell what's gonna.
All right.
Now, one that can happen though, is that if the RVCs come in and that would be some. I still don't know that we would open it up, but you have a lot of weight coming to that the RBCs. You see, like the RBCs want the plans updated every 5 years. It's not just the state regulations coming down saying we need to update.
Part of the, on the ground in this state for a lot of communities. To go and do a plan like that and have it be effective and have it make sense. There's a lot of communities in our state, they don't really, just within their community, have the resource to effectively do that. And so, we're taking the time with the RBC here. Maybe a nice thing would be some type of just recommendation about potential future legislation that the state of South Carolina develop some kind of system to help these communities do these plans and have them make sense. And so it means some money, like, so they could have a John or someone to come around and do that in a lot of these communities. Because I think you're right, Hope. We just asking them, hey, we asked them, hey, well, They don't have that, so.
That's a huge problem.
Yeah.
Like where we are. You put all these things into legislation and you don't have the funds to do it.
You can tell Charleston and Hilton Head and Greenville and Mount, but yes, okay, but
So you're saying the number one, besides update and provide state funding to help update them? Yeah. Your recommendation.
What do y'all think about that?
You like that? I like it. Hope's going 2 thumbs up. Okay. I second the motion.
Is anybody opposed to Pete's suggestion about a recommendation on funding to help provide technical capacity to water utilities that might not have it themselves to develop actionable drought management plans?
Yeah, because we're over here doing it ourselves and trying to make sure that we.
Yeah, good idea.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one question. Do they have the ability to do the water utility to develop this response ordinance or update a response ordinance? What does that mean? It says response ordinance. What does that mean?
So there's a drought management plan, right, that the utility puts together, and for that to be implemented, then typically the board or local municipality or whatever that has the jurisdiction.
We have to apply an ordinance to our code of ordinances so that that plan is put in place and we follow it.
It tells people to curtail
Yeah.
water.
Okay.
Ours, unfortunately, and I will give us our kick in the butt. And I told her ours was done in 1986. It was updated by one of our public works employees back in 2003, but it was never brought back to the council. So our ordinance still says 1986 on it. And even though we've been following a 2003 one that was updated with DNR, but it never was actually adopted by the city council. So that's what I'm having to do now is to go back and correct all that, get it updated.
So Jeff Weinberger with Duke Energy is on the broad RBC and participates in the Catawba Water Reuse Management Group. Brought up the same point you did, that he's seen examples where there's a drought management plan, but it's never been codified by an ordinance. So there's no teeth behind it. And he was recommending that the RBCs develop a recommendation saying that make sure you get your plan through the ordinance process and you get teeth behind it.
Right. Yeah. Because some of these ordinances are, is ultimately it's something like we're in X level of drought and we saw that you as a customer used X amount of water. We're going to surcharge your bill X times, things like that. So it gets into actually money of customers. And I can see a lot of councils needing something. They're not going to stay away from that because you're getting really political there about what you're going to do to people. And here's a community that's suffering a drought. We're going to start charging you more money.
Okay.
Okay, but the water utility doesn't develop the response ordinance. But
Yes,
they do. They do.
Yes, we do.
Okay,
Yes.
I now.
We have a model ordinance that came out in 2003 that it was actually Dyke Spencer he was helped primarily with our office because we've never run a water system. I've never been a water system owner. So we reached out to those that have actually operated a water system and said, help us come up with a model plan that we can get out there to water systems. And that was again back in 2003. Now that's still in place. We're not recommending a tremendous amount of changes, but then we came up with this again as a sister document to help, since we currently don't have that legislation to make them, but let us try to help you update your plan with this sister document, and we're holding those workshops around the state.
Okay, so we're going to add a recommendation about Pete's suggestion that there be some type of funding mechanism to help utilities update their plans. Circling back to this one, I heard Lynn suggest that, well, do we want to say review and update every 5 years?
I would say review and possibly update.
And possibly update or update as if
Update
needed.
is needed.
John, why didn't
5 years is
Edisto,
fine, but
why didn't Edisto adopt it? What was their objection?
It was never even considered, actually. We focus in the Edisto 3 or 4 meetings on that low flow management strategy. We spent a lot of time talking about that. We never even got around to developing any other recommendations. And at the time, there wasn't a push. This was 2020. There wasn't a push to update these drought management plans. So we didn't really talk about them as much. This came up later. I wish we would have brought it up because it'd be nice to have whole consensus among all the RBCs, but it just didn't come up.
Can I ask a question about this?
Yeah.
We said to possibly. So you can still get to 30 years not updated. Should there be a limit?
Well, update as needed, I think, what's the word?
Yeah, but so you could get to 30 years if nothing changed.
It's not needed, I guess.
Yeah, if there's no change in your source, there's no change in the population you serve that requires any changes. I mean,
Yeah, this review, you took our teeth away too.
Yeah.
But we don't have any teeth.
We
We're
don't have
trying to
any
help.
teeth.
oh, yeah,
We're trying to help hope.
The little
Get
bit of teeth,
legislation back.
the teeth we can show, we don't.
yeah. Ken and I and Joe were just talking about this during the break. Remember, these recommendations, even though they don't really have teeth, they're just going into a plan, will inform the state water plan. So when the state water plan gets written, hopefully in a year or 2, 3 years from now, it will include recommendations from the RBCs where there's a lot of consensus that they think may need to influence policy and legislation. And that state water plan will then hopefully inform policy and legislative changes.
The reason I bring it up is that if we're also gonna recommend that funding come so we can update this. Saying, just look at it every 5 years. There's not a lot of funding that's probably there just to look at it. If you're gonna change it, I'd say. Review it every 5, change it every 10, or update it every 10, something. I think you ought to have a limit, so we don't get to 30. And if you're gonna ask for funding, then you're going to have to change it at some point or update it at some point.
I mean, certainly there's gonna be a contact change. In 5 to 10 years,
So
I don't think it's unreasonable to say.
I think having it so open as you just changed by saying review and potentially, I don't think that's.
What if it's like review and resubmit, update and resubmit so that you, I guess Hope's mentions before, is there a requirement that they actually submit it to you for review? There is, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
It had to be.
But one time counts, right?
Yeah, for the update, there's no requirement, is there? If they change it, are there
Because the
requirements?
legislation doesn't say updated, there's nothing that
Yeah.
legislatively requires them to.
Yeah.
But yet, if they update their ordinance and then it's out of compliance with the legislation, then, so that you sort of, it is, I would say indirectly, that they go and update their plan and they take out that we don't want triggers. We don't want to have enforcement, so we're gonna take out enforcement. Then it's no longer compliant with the original model ordinance that the state has in place. Because the model I can't make you have certain enforcement. Like, if you want to only charge $10 for a violation, there is nothing we can do about it. But you need to have a section on enforcement. So that's why it is, if you're changing it, to make sure it's going to be compliant and any changes that you make, you need to submit it to the state.
I don't know what the number is. I just think that seems like review and possibly update.
It's too vague.
I think it.
I like the number of years, just having a number of years in there to just, whatever it is.
Move it out to 10, whatever, and then recommend funding help. So
Yeah, we need to have funding as a separate item.
But what does the rest of the RBC think? Do you like 5 years? Or do you like review and update if needed in 5 years, or would you rather have it more definite on, we really want you to do it at least every 10 years or something? But is there a comment online?
From Tommy, suggested it be similar to what we do with the comprehensive plan, reviewed and updated every 5 years with a requirement to update every 10 years.
Okay, that's kind of a middle ground. Review and update
Every 5 years with a requirement to update every 10 years.
Okay, so you don't necessarily have to update it in 5 years, but you're reviewing it. But every 10 years, you have to update it. So submit it, basically.
It's a big.
You're shaking your head. You like that? Does that help you out? Okay, that's a good compromise. Review and update if needed.
Are we leaving if needed in there or are we?
For 5 years, it seemed like it was, yeah, if needed. For 10 years,
I thought we were
you had.
bracketing it 5 to, basically 5 to 10 years, but if needed, then it comes out. Because there's no driver at all if it stays the way you got it drafted.
I'm not following. Are you saying take out if needed here?
I am. And then go to your 5 to 10 years. However we want to put the qualifiers in there.
Every 5 years.
Review every 5 years.
Review every 5 years and require an
Every 10
update every
years.
10 years.
There you go.
Right, leave that.
I'll keep that.
That's enough. So we can vote on it.
I was gonna add and review and update every 10 years. That work?
Yep. Keep the order frequent. That's still good.
Everybody good with that?
Yeah.
Okay,
And then we need to add state. Encourage the state to provide funding for those.
Yep.
That need help. Don't have to do this work.
put it in there, but I'll add that in funding. Okay. All right, there's another related recommendation to that. Let's see if we can tackle that and then we'll break for lunch. This one was that the RBC recommends that water utilities, when updating their drought plan response ordinance, look for opportunities to develop response actions that are consistent with those of neighboring utilities. This is response actions, not triggers, right? So the impetus of this, I think, was from the broad RBC, where there's a lot of utilities in the upstate that were sending out mixed messages, and they thought there might be confusion among the different customers that are adjacent to each other that are getting water from 3-4 different utilities. So they said, well, it probably makes sense to have consistent responses. The Saluda, though, didn't agree. They said, no, we don't care that there's potentially inconsistency. They felt that people know where they get their water, they get the messaging from their utility, and they're not going to be confused about Greenville Water saying one thing and easily combined utilities saying another thing. That wasn't a concern with them. But that was for the broad. The broad felt that, well, we want the same message coming from Spartanburg and SJWD and Greer and Inman Campobello. So there was some disagreement about that. But generally, there was more agreement that messaging is important and there should be some kind of consistency. So the PD, Broad, and Upper Savannah all felt that that was important. Saluda decided not.
So how would that play in a state water plan? What would there be? I mean, how would it play out?
I'm not sure, honestly.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how the authors of the state water plan would take that recommendation, how they would.
And what does
how they would craft.
consistency mean?
Right.
Water
Couldn't there be
utilities are so
there could be a different issue at Hilton Head than there is in another area?
And here I am in a groundwater area, and my neighbor is Beaufort, and they're
Right.
very different, so.
Yeah.
Even the triggers, I mean.
Yeah.
Triggers certainly should all be are very similar, but the way you react is sometimes differently too.
Right.
You know,
The consistency was, if you go from severe to extreme, then the consistent the same group of customers in each utility, like residential, would be required to only water on odd even days. So they wanted consistency there. They didn't want one utility saying, no, you can continue to water your lawns 5 out of 7 days of the week. And then the neighboring utility saying, hey, you have to go to odd even. That's just one example. They didn't want that confusion there. But again, the Saluda felt like, well, we're not worried. There's not going to be confusion. The messaging from each utility is specific to their customers.
Right.
And we don't think that they're going to get confused. So it's just a difference of opinion.
But there's no practical way to implement that, right?
This recommendation or the response part that we're talking about?
That,
This recommendation?
right. It's just a statement.
It's just a statement,
Which
right? Just encourages
It's
utilities
logical,
to.
but there's no way to really.
Yeah.
Well, there are differences for y'all, I mean, because y'all are all, there's 3 of you in Hilton, so.
It'd be probably pretty similar. There's different like rate structures. So when you get into the part about what you're doing on the rates in response and everything, but you could just maybe simplify something like this to say, because you're just talking about that, you know, the drafting of the plans and response regs or ordinances. You could maybe just have something like encouragement to review and or implement, yeah, well, hopes, the guidance document that Hope's Department just put out. I'm sorry, I forget what we call it, but you know, that John's holding there, you know, they put out this guideline.
Right. It already provides some consistency if you follow it, is what you're saying.
So if we were all kind of.
But because recommendation 1 says you have to submit it anyway, you're doing that anyway. And this, I don't see the value in this, particularly over the big range from Augusta to.
Yeah, well, again, the genesis of this was from the broad RBC and there in the upstate, there's a number of utilities that get together on a monthly basis and talk about things like this. And because they're already coordinating on different water resource related issues, they thought that, yeah, that's something that we can easily coordinate on and let's make sure we're consistent with our messaging. But again, that was kind of unique to the broad. Some of the other basins went along with it, but not always. Saluda did.
I don't hear us.
I don't see.
Yeah, I agree. I don't see the same, yeah, right. A lot of you are groundwater, your triggers are different. You're not really impacted by, short-term droughts sometimes. So I'm not hearing that y'all think this is important.
Got a question here. Would the water source and capacity of the different utility providers cause differing impacts on the capacity and drought impact?
Well, if I think I understand the question right, yes. I mean, some utilities have, you know, a lot of water, big source. Other utilities have smaller sources. And they're going to be more impacted by drought and would hit those stages a lot earlier than other utilities. With multiple sources. Yeah, and that's all going to be in your plan. Yeah. Okay. Okay, what I'm hearing is like the Saluda RBC, you all don't think this one is really useful as a recommendation for your basins. Is that?
Agreed.
I agree.
Okay, and I think we can still add language in chapter 8 that suggests that utilities start with the guidance document to help kind of ensure a base of consistency, and then they can differentiate it as needed.
Yeah, because like Elliot in Hope's office is even, along with looking at the guidance document, he's forwarded me some other utilities plans that obviously he's kind of considering as like a best practice example.
All right. Okay. All right, good. So we're going to strike this one. Okay, before we get to this one, let's break for lunch. There's 3 more after this. I want to leave enough time for Joe and Brooke. So we'll probably during lunch, go ahead and jump over to groundwater to make sure we get their presentations in. And then if we have time, we'll come back to these. And if we don't get back to them now, we'll get back to them probably at the November meeting. They shouldn't take a whole lot of time though. So it's 12:05. We'll start up again, maybe 12:25, and you can finish your lunch as Brooke starts your presentation at 12:25. So online folks, be ready around 12:25. We've got 2 presentations this afternoon on groundwater. Brooke is going to do the first one. And if you recall, way back to the second or third meeting, Brooke gave an overview of groundwater resources in the Lower Savannah-Salkehatchie. She's going to rehash a little bit of what she talked about and then build upon that. And then the second presentation, Joe, you're going to give, Joe Kuhn's going to give, and it's going to focus on groundwater management areas. So we're starting to get into groundwater. Before we do that, I want to mention that there's been a change to the planning process. The groundwater modeling in the PD basin has been taking longer than expected. If you recall, USGS has been updating this regional groundwater model that covers the entire coastal plain and stretches into Georgia and North Carolina. When they went to update that, there was some issues they discovered with not having all of the pumping for North Carolina, so they had to do recalibration. Now they've been working on calibrating an inset model of just the PD basin to support the PD basin planning effort. And that is unfortunately taking longer than expected. So just last week, the PD planning team, DES and others decided it was more important to move on and finish the PD plan. And they decided to put the groundwater modeling for the PD on the back burner. So the PD RBC is going to move forward without doing the groundwater modeling. They're going to take a different approach, and that different approach is, excuse me, it's still being kind of developed, but it's based on just looking at existing information, looking at projected demands, doing more of a desktop analysis, not using the groundwater model. After that decision was made, DES thought about it some more with regard to the planning effort in this basin and then in the Santee Basin, which is going to start up here in a few months, and decided that it'd probably be better to move forward without the groundwater modeling for those basins as well. I think their intent is still to work with the USGS potentially and do that, but it won't be part of this initial planning process. So that's a little different than what we've said up until now, where we did surface water modeling, and then we said we're going to then come back with the groundwater modeling when the USGS was ready, because they were still finishing work in the PD basin. What we're going to do instead is quickly move over to groundwater, starting with some presentations today by Brooke and Joe, and then we'll talk about groundwater in the coming months. We'll have Alex Pellet and Clemson hopefully finish developing the groundwater demands. We'll look at those demands. We'll look at historical data where there's been issues, and Brooke's going to talk about that. And we'll decide what information can we evaluate and look at to inform our management plan. But we're not going to do groundwater modeling like we did surface water modeling. So that's going to allow us actually to probably finish on time and maybe even a little bit ahead of time. The Saluda and the Upper Savannah have been moving a little quicker than the 2-year process. They're likely to finish a little bit ahead of 2 years. And that may be the case in this basin as well, but we do want to spend some time considering all the groundwater information we have and doing some type of, I'll say, desktop analysis to help identify potential recommendations or areas of concern, identify where maybe more monitoring are recommended. Whatever y'all decide that we can do within the time frame and the available scope and budget. Any questions about that, or Joe or Scott, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it pretty good. There's questions, we can sort of try to answer.
Okay. Any questions?
Will there be an opportunity to get back to it at some point, or is it going to be further along in the process towards the state plan?
Yeah, well, we do plan on finishing the work with the USGS, but more or less outside of the context of the RBC. I hope that we'd be able to include it, incorporate it to a later iteration planning or do it, and kind of report on it, or we can share, summarize the results. But it likely won't be done by the time most of the plans. Won't be incorporation of that. Most likely. And the schedule of completion, I would say, even with the USGS, it's probably still a little up in the air. The calibration machine they've been having.
There, you all are doing your own groundwater modeling. You've supported groundwater modeling. Didn't you tell me Nutter and Associates was doing modeling? So there is modeling going on, you know, in specific areas at a local scale, specifically for issues that Pete's dealt with, saltwater intrusion. So that may be information that we can review and consider potentially if you all decide that's interesting and useful. But there is some modeling going on in the basin. Just won't be at a broad scale like we originally envisioned. Okay, well, if there's no more questions, then I'll turn it over to Brooke. You ready?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep, this is where-
Okay, you share that report with me. But some of the information didn't make it into this report because this presentation was made thinking that we are going forward with the model. So it's gonna rely heavily on potentiometric maps. And what's not included in this is the water use information. So now we're going to take these potentiometric maps over time, add water use in them, look at where water use has occurred, where we expect it to continue, and then make decisions off of that, similar to what we've decided to forge through in the PD. So some of this is going to be review. I feel like in December, when I gave the presentation, we were running out of time, and so I flew through it. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time today talking about the individual aquifers and some of the patterns that we're seeing over time, and then spend a very short amount of time at the very end talking about saltwater intrusion that's occurring in the upper Florida aquifer. Okay, so we've seen some of these slides before, but I just want to set the setting. We've got 3 physiographic provinces in South Carolina. Our basins, the lower Savannah and Salkehatchie, are completely in the coastal plain. And that starts at the fall line, where the elevation is approximately 450 feet, down to the coastline, where basically the land elevation is at 0. Most of South Carolina's water is in the coastal plain. 95% of the water is locked up in these coastal plain aquifers. The sediments thicken from 0 at the fall line to 4,000 feet at Hilton Head. So we have this very large triangular wedge of sediments. They're composed of sand, clay, silt, and limestone. And the permeable sand and limestone form the aquifers, and then the clay layers form the confining units. Here is a view of the South Carolina hydrogeologic framework along dip, showing these aquifers going from the fall line to the coastline. And it's shaped, it's kind of similar to like a layer cake, which represents from when the ocean coastline was at Columbia, back and forth. There were millions and millions of years laying in higher velocity environments, slower velocity environments to end up in different aquifers and confining units. So here, we're right here, the fall line at Bacon, 450 feet elevation, the coastline about 10 feet, this basement rock is about 4,000 feet. And then moving down, starting with the superficial aquifer, the water table aquifer, and you'll have different pieces of these confining layers coming in, starting with the upper Floridan aquifer. This is that limestone aquifer, middle Floridan aquifer. This is more limestone sand, Gordon aquifer, which has also been called the Black Mingo Santee limestone. That could be similar to the lower Floridan aquifer that's sometimes been named informally in Hilton Head. The Crouch Branch aquifer, the McQueen Branch aquifer, the Charleston aquifer, and then the Basal aquifer is the Grambling. These upper aquifers are considered the tertiary aquifers, and anything below that is considered the Cretaceous. So that's that line of 66 million years, starting with that Crouch Branch aquifer. And most of those are sand aquifers. In some areas towards the coast, the deeper you get, there's more silt, and so it becomes less permeable. And then the McQueen Branch aquifer is actually not present in this lower portion here, but the Charleston aquifer and the Grambling aquifer. These are sandy, but then have clay lenses in them and under a tremendous amount of pressure. So when you move up towards The fall line, some of these aquifers, they coalesce and they end up being hydraulically connected. And sometimes they can act like water table conditions. But it's sandy up here. And so it can, the water table can be quite deep. And so some of the hydrographs that I'll show, would exhibit water table, but also aquifer conditions in those areas. And I'll expand on that a little bit more. So, in the lower Savannah-Salkehatchie region, we have all of these aquifers present. We've got the upper Floridan, the middle Floridan, the Gordon, the Crouch Branch, the McQueen Branch, the Charleston, and the Grambling. Grambling's not shown because it looks very similar to the Charleston. In each one of these maps, I'm showing the aquifer extent in yellow. And then the hatched area for each one of these is where the aquifer is recharged. So the aquifer is very close to the surface in these recharge zones. And is readily, rainfall precipitation is readily falling down into the aquifer and recharging. The upper Floridan, middle Floridan, and Gordon aquifer, they've all been mapped together previously. And we've parsed them out and look at them separately. They do have different water characteristics about them. But one of the things I want to note, especially in looking at this area, is that these overlap with one another, these recharge areas. So that's where they could all come together as the Steed Pond aquifer. Now, in the Cretaceous aquifers, looking at the Crouch Branch, the McQueen Branch, and Charleston, these cover a larger portion of the state and are generally recharged along the fall line in the Sandhills region. These are very deep, recharge is very slow. And therefore, at the coast, we've seen in certain areas some declines due to this long time of recharge. The Charleston aquifer and the Gordon aquifer both do not have outcrop areas in South Carolina. They depend on recharge from other aquifers to be recharged. And then, like I said, so this upper Floridan, this is considered limestone. It gets sandier as you move up dip. Some limestone in the middle Floridan. This is a sandy limestone, and then these are largely sand with a clay in them. Okay, so I'm going to get into some of the water use, but I wanted to introduce and not kind of step on Joe's toes, but capacity use areas present in our basin. So capacity use areas are areas defined by DES, Groundwater Use and Reporting Act, or something that was before that, that any user that uses more than 3 million gallons or more in 1 month at any time during the year, for ownership of wells within a 1 mile radius must apply for a permit. And so as of currently, all of the counties have been incorporated in the coastal plain counties have been incorporated into a capacity use area. The two capacity use areas that we have in these basins are the low country area shown in blue here, and then the western area shown in this lime green. The low country area includes Beaufort, Colleton, and Jasper, and was formed in 1981. And then the western area is Aiken, Allendale, Bamberg, Barnell, Calhoun, Lexington, and Orangeburg. Now, not all of these counties are represented in our basin, but we have these westernmost counties. So in each one of these capacity use areas, groundwater use for these 3 million gallons a month users is regulated, and periodically on a renewal schedule, groundwater management plans are put out so that they can examine the use that has occurred from the self-reported users over that period of time, so that they can ensure sustainable and beneficial use of groundwater resources. And this is an ongoing thing, and I'll let Joe talk much more about it because it's not our program, it's our other program. So here are the water withdrawals from 2023. Y'all saw this before for 2022. We've just been updated. Not any changed here. We've got over 900 registered and permitted users shown in the basin. In the basins. Now, this isn't all the groundwater use. This is only the registered and permitted. So anybody that fell underneath that threshold
Ag is registered, everyone else is permitted. In groundwater, everyone in the capacity use area is permitted, and everyone not in the capacity use area, that's in counties above the fault line, those are registered.
So ag is permitted.
Ag is permitted, yeah, for over 3 million gallons. Yes, so.
And they're all monitored.
They are all of these that are shown on this map right here are reported, self-reported to the regulatory agency. I'm gonna defer.
Registered and permitted are both reported.
That's correct.
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
Self-reported.
It's self-reported.
Right.
Yes, okay.
Quick question. Thank you. Think that energy 68.
Because,
For groundwater. 68 MGD for groundwater, including and 72 excluding.
I don't know.
And maybe sewage.
maybe. No. We'll come back to
Same
that.
number.
It's
Same number, different percent.
different percentage, a different percentage, because we took out the thermo power generation.
The number went up.
The number, sorry, that was a mistake. I got this. Okay, I apologize. Okay, I will get that corrected. I apologize.
The only reason I noticed it, because I was looking at the Edisto, and the Edisto's groundwater demand is almost exactly the same as these two basins combined, around 72, 73 MGD. Which that was interesting, that basically it's the same, but that's what I noticed, the 68, 72. And that makes sense there for including and excluding energy.
But I will fix that. I apologize. Okay.
So what is that the right balance on the right? Is it?
Yes, it should be the right balance on the right.
So excluding energy, there's more groundwater.
There's more groundwater when you remove, when you remove thermoelectric power from the equation, there's more groundwater use than there's surface water use. Because, so I will check those numbers. I apologize. I made these, and if they're incorrect, I will correct these. So,
If they're incorrect, I think it's minor. The point is like, yeah.
so including energy, this is including energy, just to show you that water supply and agricultural irrigation make up about 90% of the water use in the basins.
Button on here, then we're good. Try it now.
Okay, so here are the reported groundwater withdrawals, including energy from 2013 to 23. Not much change here in 2022. Now, there could be more reporting due to that 2018 addition to the Western capacity use area. There's not really a trend here. There could be a slight uptick of a trend, but I don't want to make any kind of conclusions of this, just to say that, water use in this basin has increased since 2013 and it's kind of stabled off. Okay, so moving on to the groundwater monitoring network. Again, I've showed this to you before. This is a product from the DNR that's come over now to the DES, where we have monitoring wells, dedicated monitoring wells open to a specific aquifer installed, where we collect continuous hourly data that is downloaded on a quarterly basis and added to a database. There's 75 sites actively monitored within the basins, completed in 9 aquifers. And the period of record ranges from 4 to 69 years. In the greater coastal plain and in the state, there's over 180 wells. We're always adding wells, but this network is not enough to tell us exactly what's going on in the aquifers. So we have to use, we have a potentiometric monitoring network that's comprised of over 450 wells to look at individual aquifers and assess changes in storage over time. So before we get into the maps, I just kind of want to talk about what are we looking at when I'm talking about a potentiometric map. So here's just kind of a cartoon of an aquifer with elevation is our scale. So we're looking at elevation. It's in some maps, it's referred to mean sea level. We've converted a lot of it to NAV 88, so the North American Vertical Datum of 88, because when you are farther away from the coast, you have a differential, so between sea level and that, and so we've tried to move a lot of our products over that so that they can be compared. We here have an unconfined water table aquifer. We've got a confining layer and a confined or artesian aquifer. Artesian is just meaning that it's pressurized underneath a confining layer, another confining layer, and bedrock. So in the recharge zone, we have precipitation falling on the Earth's surface and recharging. Could be a confined aquifer in its recharge zones where it's missing its confining unit. And we have that water falling directly on the water table, and maybe some leakage going down through layers to replenish the pressure in the aquifers. We've got wells installed in water table aquifer or confined aquifer. And that level to which the water level is coming up into that well is that potentiometric surface. And so this potentiometric surface of the confined aquifer is this imaginary surface that runs for any well that's completed in that aquifer. Okay. So here this is an example of a potentiometric map. This is from our 2016 surface of the Crouch Branch aquifer. So the potentiometric contour of the aquifer is in feet relative to NAVD 88. And in all of the maps, you're going to see they're dashed with their approximate. So this is the level in feet in which the water rises in tightly closed wells. Typically, when we make these maps, we try to only use wells that are screened in one aquifer. We try to avoid aquifer wells that have dual screens in them so that we're getting a good representation. And so we can look at changes in groundwater storage, we can look at the direction of flow gradients. These are represented by these contours. So water always flows perpendicular to contour lines. And then these features here on a map, this cone of depression is like an upside down mountain. So water is flowing into that cone of depression. And another water is flowing in a southeasterly direction here. But there will be features of water use on these maps that will influence the direction and steepness of these contour lines. Yes, ma'am.
So tell me about the approximated areas, because I can't help but notice that a majority of our river basin, like Hampton, Beaufort, Jasper, the dashed lines. So is that because you don't have the data?
Yes, and I'm going to get into that. So yes. Okay, and then cones of depression in South Carolina. These are our major cones. We don't have any cones of depression in the lower Savannah-Salkehatchie, but we do have an area of lower pressure that is present as you get towards the coast, as influenced by pumping in Savannah, Georgia. We have some major cones of depression where they're centered on pumping wells, and then the influence can spread out, for tens of miles, and can be either a shallow area or it can be a wide dispersed area.
Why is there one in Florence?
Due to pumping from the Florence water system out of the McQueen Branch aquifer. It's a very localized cone. And so Florence is looking at surface water and looking at supplementing their water supply. It shows up and kind of goes away, and but it's persisted for some time. It's a very, very shallow and a very narrow cone. Not like something that we've seen in Georgetown or Myrtle Beach, where it's become very chronic. Okay, so I'm going to get into the maps. We're going to see a bunch of these. These are our potentiometric contours. We've been making these maps for a really long time. In every single one of these instances, I'm going to show you the pre-development map from the 1880s before groundwater development occurred. And then I'm going to show our most recent map. So I am acknowledging that there are many, many, many time steps in between this. And we have maps that we can look at over time for each one of these aquifers and look at water use to make decisions in lieu of having a model. And so what I'm showing here is the upper and middle Floridan aquifer. Spoiler. So these areas here represent the recharge zones that I showed you on that map with all the aquifer extents. So this map here, so one of the things I wanted to note is that these are mapped together because Their water levels are very similar with one another and they track very similar. It's primarily used for agriculture, water supply, and looking at the water use for 2023 golf course irrigation secondary. And the pumping centers at Hilton Head, Georgia have shifted these gradients, which I'm going to show in this next map. And water level declines since pre-development have been between 25 and 45 feet at the coast. And this is where the saltwater intrusion issue is. So over here on the left with this pre-development, these dots are the monitoring wells that were used. And what you're going to notice in these is that the same wells are not used over time, because a lot of these, some of these are monitoring wells, some of these are irrigation wells or public supply wells, but they might not be in existence anymore. And that is, I guess, one of the weaknesses of making maps like this, because you don't have the same spot every single time, which is why we've tried to increase our dedicated monitoring well network. But this offers far more resolution that we can ever give in a dedicated monitoring network, just because there's not enough land to be putting dedicated monitoring wells on. So at pre-development time, we have this general kind of straight along lines. Remember, the elevation at the fall line is about 450 feet. These contours start at 350 feet and go to 25 feet. So there could have been, artesian conditions here at the coast. There could have been flowing waves, flowing water, and in some areas that we know that there are some springs down here near Paris Island. The curved lines up here indicate that there's some sort of interaction with surface water bodies. And so we can have the aquifers discharging into surface water bodies, helping with base flow. So general movement towards off the coast. Now, looking at 2021, I know this is a lot of time, we can see that groundwater development has changed this. Here we have kind of a groundwater divide where the water is actually kind of discharging towards the Savannah River. We have some more, here. And then as it moves down, we've curved the contours towards this area of low pressure here. So from going straight out from southeast to curving down towards what's occurring in Georgia. And if you look at this line right here, this is a 20-foot contour to a negative 20-foot contour. And so we have a change of 40 feet over that. And there's actually about a 12-foot difference even moving across Hilton Head in contour lines, which has led to, a changing gradient over time from groundwater development. I'm going to show a couple hydrographs from each aquifer. It's going to be the same pattern for each aquifer going forward. So I've got some upper Floridan wells and upper middle Floridan wells that I'm going to show in different areas of the basin for different purposes. So I showed this one to y'all before as well. This is the upper Floridan aquifer in Beaufort County. This is located somewhere kind of down towards the South Island PSD district area. On the left x-axis, this is water level below land surface. On the right y-axis, I have water level reference to feet elevation. So, and then time along the bottom. This is upper Floridan aquifer. And what I wanted to show in this is groundwater development in Hilton Head started about 1950. And it continued on until at a great rate until it reached like 14 million gallons a day until 1999. So the capacity use area kicked in 1995 and reduced those withdrawals, and surface water supplementation started to come in around that 1999 as well. And so you can see right here where this big decrease kind of stopped, but we still see this like really large amplitude of seasonal use. And we think that we could attribute this to more unpermitted users, maybe more golf course, more residential irrigation to drive that larger amplitude. But this is still under tidal pressure, but there has been kind of a flattening out. And this is a pure case due to using other parts of water besides this Floridan aquifer. Okay, so this is an example of the upper and middle Floridan aquifer paired together. This is at Waddell Mariculture Center that we visited for the field trip. what I wanted to show here, we've got the middle Florida aquifer depicted in black and the upper Florida aquifer depicted in blue. Again, there's not a lot of change. We're talking only 16 feet and a pretty strong one tidal signal and seasonal signal probably from localized pumping. The reason why I wanted to show this is because there are several water utilities that are utilizing the middle Florida aquifer as aquifer storage and recovery. And so on the island. And so but we can still see that there's there's just like less than a foot difference between these two aquifers. Even occurring with use of the middle Florida aquifer, and neither are showing a decline. Okay, I wanted to move up the basin a little bit. This is in Hampton County. Again, looking at an upper Floridan and a middle Floridan well. So you can see that there's a very strong seasonal signal. I haven't dug down into what water use is really occurring right here, but there could be some agricultural use around here that's affecting this. But generally I see a seasonal signal. I can see that we can see the flash drop from 2019. You can see the little drought that we had in 2020. But maybe a general uptick, but a decoupling of the two aquifers and but a little bit deeper as well. Okay, so the Gordon Aquifer, we previously mapped the Gordon Aquifer with the Floridan Aquifer until 2016, then when we pulled them out. And so this map here for pre-development is the same as the Floridan that I showed before. We have, this general trend of discharging out to the coast, about 25 feet here. It's primarily used in the basin for agriculture, water supply, and industry second. We have a lot of wells here present in Colleton County in the Salkehatchie Basin. This is a lot of rural public supply and fire stations that we were able to get to be able to make these contours. And one of the things about the Gordon Aquifer, not present in this basin, but it trends brackish towards the coast. But one of the things to note is that zero line of contour is pretty much all the way up here in Walterboro, and then it outside of this basin, but tends to be below sea level. So anywhere where there's conditions that are below sea level is a potential for saltwater intrusion, and it's just what we're seeing in here. But these contour lines are, there's not a lot of use down in this portion of the basin just because there's more productive aquifers that are above it. And so it tends to bend out towards Charleston and towards the basins that are using this more heavily. I'm going to show one well, however, in Allendale that is using the Gordon Aquifer. This is a Gordon Aquifer well in Allendale County. This is C10. I actually showed this to y'all back in December, but it was on a different map, and so it was really hard to see. So one thing I wanted to notice though is, how deep this water level is here. We're talking 148 feet deeper. So one can see in the late 90s or maybe the early 2000s is a decline. Now this is only about a rate of 1 foot a year, which is a sustainable rate of loss of head. But if there's more pumping that it can occur in this aquifer, it shows that this aquifer is sensitive to pumping. There's some farmlands near here, and we can see this like kind of diurnal signal, seasonal signal of pumping. Having water use tied in with some of this will be really helpful in the future. All right, the Crouch Branch Aquifer. So when we look at the Crouch Branch and we look at the following aquifers, we're not going to have a lot of resolution in this part of the state. We literally still don't have like really any wells to represent the aquifer surface. And so we'll have these inferred lines of where we think that surface is. But generally this aquifer is just kind of discharging off to the southeast. Same here. All of these wells right here are actually all monitoring wells at SRS. And so I don't have water use for those, but there's few wells that are permitted in the coastal counties due to there's more productive aquifers that are shallower. There's been very minor declines since pre-development. We don't have these contours up here to indicate what the aquifer levels were here, but we do have some wells up here. But we're not seeing anything in this basin to be of concern. It's more, it's in the Georgetown area where this is a really heavily used aquifer. But it's to be said that when you get close to the coast with these, the sediments get finer. And so there's, you know, less use, usability and productivity to use it. Still, I'm going to show a well located in Aiken County. And I'm going to do that on a following map. I'm going to do the McQueen because they're on the map together. So here again with the McQueen, very few McQueen Charleston aquifer, very few data points to indicate what type of conditions were occurring in pre-development in the basins. But we have a little bit more resolution now. Looking at these aquifers, again, we can see where it kind of, since it's close to the surface, it's kind of a groundwater divide. It pulls off into the Savannah River. But you know, most of the pumping is in the Charleston area. But in these aquifers, there's a tremendous amount of pressure. And so even here, this is a well located on Hilton Head Island. This is a 125-foot contour. That means that the water is shooting 125 feet into the air. And so there's a lot of pressure in that well. We did recently have 2 wells on Paris Island, but they've been decommissioned, and those were in the Charleston aquifer. And then we have this 1 well in the Grambling aquifer to kind of pull these contours down. It's primarily used for water supply, the irrigation, and again, few wells. There is a RO well in the Grambling that's used in Hilton Head by the South Island PSD. And it is flowing at the coast. So this is the same well for the Crouch Branch that I'm going to show, and then I'm going to show this additional well down dip. This is the well cluster site. So here I've got the McQueen branch in black, and I have the Crouch Branch in gray. These also track pretty well together, and this is one of the areas where those aquifers are coming together. And there's about a 5-foot difference between these two. And there's a long-term decline down until the late 2010s. And then we've slowly seen an uptick. There's some industrial and some agricultural and some water supply use in this area. But so I just wanted to highlight that how this responds kind of, typically in the recharge area response to pumping. So I would love to see what type of pumping pressures in this area, so that we can, understand, why we're seeing these changes over this course of time. Okay, and finally, this is the last hydrograph. So this is the Grambling aquifer. This is like 3,700 feet deep. This is like the basal aquifer from 2000 to 2024. So there's been, there was a pretty large decline that occurred until 2014, but it's leveled out. But we are still seeing about 125 feet of positive pressure. And in other areas of the state, this aquifer has been investigated to look and see if it's a source of water. It's being used currently in Hilton Head for South Island PSD. I believe they're putting in another system as well. And so it could be as an alternative source of water. It's very warm. It requires reverse osmosis, but possibly a viable source of water.
What do you think made it level out today?
This isn't. I don't have the pumping data from that utility to indicate if they've slowed down on it. And so that's just one thing that I just want to admit in this presentation, that I wasn't prepared to bring in all of the water use data, and hoping that the permitting staff at DES and it can help bring that into the conversation where I've typically just talked about water levels and monitoring and what we've observed from a mapping standpoint. And so we will get those answers. I just wanted to present this information today. And now knowing that we're not moving forward with the model, we can see what type of information are we missing and where should we put our efforts when looking at how are we going to have groundwater until 2070? In lieu of having a model, we've got to look at historical use and figure out, how we're going to manage those water sources into the future. Okay, so this, I also showed this. I wanted to, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the saltwater intrusion, just because that is our big issue and our big feature on the map. in the basin. So the Kona Depression is not centered in South Carolina. It is centered over Savannah. So here is another map. This is from the Geological Survey report from 2006, showing that pre-development contours, and they're moving to the southeast. And then in this pretty much worst case scenario here in May and September of 1998, we have a tremendous cone of depression that is centered over Savannah. And over time, what it did, all of the pumping in Hilton Head and Savannah reversed the gradient. So it pulled not only the water direction towards Savannah, it also pulled the water quality towards Savannah. So here in this other depiction, just to kind of look at it from a cartoon standpoint, where we once had water flowing through the Floridan aquifer to the southeast. In present day, we reversed that gradient. So one of the things I got like a little bit of a timeline to talk about. So in the 1880s is when the first wells were drilled in both Savannah and at Parris Island. And they started pumping at about 7 million gallons a day in Savannah. And then by 1903, the wells at Parris Island succumbed to saltwater intrusion. And there even was in locations near Parris Island where water would well up in the estuary and fresh water could be retrieved from those springs. And when that gradient reversed, that salt water started to pull through. So the pumping at Hilton Head started in the 1950s, as I had said, but by the 1940s, the gradient had already been reversed, and the wells in Beaufort started to be impacted first in 1940s. So pumping continued on, and then in 1995, as I showed before, that low country capacity use area was created. Up until this 1998 time step right here, the pumping at Hilton Head had reached 14.5 million gallons a day. And as part of the capacity use area, it was capped at 9.5 million gallons a day. In 1999, Hilton Head started supplementing with surface water supplies, as shown in that hydrograph. And you can kind of see it level out there, even though that amplitude continued to increase. And they were one, slowing the salt from coming, and also just trying to enhance that freshwater supply. So here in 1998, we'll stop here, we'll look back at this map. So this cone is down 130 feet from pre-development levels. And at its worst, it was down to 120 feet mean sea level and 150 feet below its pre-developed levels. In 2010, the Georgia Water Stewardship Act came in and kicked in, and they did some conservation measures and were able to cause that cone to rebound up to negative 70, so 70 mean sea level. And that's kind of where it sits right now. There's some data from USGS wells that are in the upper Florida and over here, kind of in the Savannah area, that suggests that it's kind of sitting at a 70-foot cone. But that damage instead was done because the current had reversed.
What did they do?
I need to look into that. I think they started putting more, they capped some of it, and then they started taking more water out of the Savannah River. So,
They made major improvements and increase in Savannah River water. It's all of the northern part of Savannah, pretty much is now operating on surface water. But internally in the city, you're still dealing with groundwater. You can tell if you go to Savannah in town and you take a drink of water out of their tap, it will taste distinctly different than it does if you take that same drink up near the airport.
oh, really?
Completely different,
That's
because it's a
neat.
different water flow.
Brooke, what effect did the dredging of the harbor have on the groundwater there?
Nothing yet,
Nothing yet.
nothing yet.
Yeah.
They're close, and they're right there. on top of
Aren't they
that.
within a foot?
Pretty close
Yeah,
to the
pretty-
top of that zone.
And the harbor's dredged to what?
Right now, the harbor stretched to,
48?
yeah, it's close to that, but the plans to deepen it. They're gonna deepen it, raise the bridge, and, you know, they had the option of building port facilities further closer to the ocean. Made the decision, no, we're coming up, we're gonna raise the bridge up and put all new docks on the, guess we're doing on the northern side of the Savannah. So we're gonna dramatically increase the size of that port.
So the dredging is not all completed, is it?
No, they're going again.
Yeah,
They're going in for another permit for more dredging.
Okay, so, just some points about the saltwater intrusion. So the Hilton Head's susceptible to saltwater intrusion due to the surface and near surface geology. So that confining unit that's present over the Florida aquifer is either absent or it's like 10 feet deep. And so leakage has occurred through that of even saltwater sources. I got this map here, showing there's some known holes for saltwater intrusions and suspected holes. And so, what I'm showing here, and Pete shared this with me, this line right here, is a demarcation of the chloride 250 milligrams per liter line. This is the EPA limit. It has progressed some, since then, but I just wanted to show this kind of as, an indicator that we know where it is, we kind of know where it's going. It's moving at about a little less than 500 feet a day across the island. There are some monitoring that is being done by Hilton Head to indicate where that is going and how fast it's going. And so,
So it took 500 feet a day.
No, not a few, okay?
not a day, I'm sorry, a year.
But maybe.
Maybe. There's a couple, yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't. Yeah, I'm really not. Okay, so there's not 500 feet a day. Okay,
She's testing.
I was just seeing if everybody was listening.
Yes.
Pumping in Hilton Head and Savannah are factors involved in this saltwater intrusion in Hilton Head Island. And reduction in pumping at both centers is required to stop the plume growth. But the plumes will exist into the future, but they would just move slowly with that groundwater gradient. And so even if we stop all the pumping, the salt's not going to go anywhere. It may slow down, but it's there. It's very difficult to get out of the matrix. There are several water management strategies in practice to currently support freshwater supply. There's conjunctive water use that's being employed by Hilton Head Public Service District, aquifer storage and recovery of the Middle Florida aquifer, reverse osmosis is being done on the Middle Florida aquifer as well. And they're expanding one more aquifer storage and recovery well. South Island PSD, they are the ones that are in the Grambling. They use the Grambling and they have one unit, one well. They're doing another one to do reverse osmosis on that deeper Cretaceous Grambling aquifer. And then Broad Creek has a ASR as well, or they're adding one as well. So there's a lot of things being done on the island to help to support freshwater sources. I couldn't get out of this without mentioning, that we are connected to another state and that Georgia has been working on planning too. So the Coastal Georgia Regional Water Plan was just recently updated in 2023. There's 9 counties in this plan. 2 of them border our South Carolina in the lower Savannah. So groundwater from the Florida aquifer is 65% of the water that comes from the coastal Georgia region, but their 2023 update determined that at a regional level, the modeled aquifers have sufficient groundwater to meet their forecasted needs over the planning horizon to 2060. We're planning out to 2070, but their challenges will occur in areas where saltwater intrusion is an issue. So they also state that historic groundwater withdrawals in Savannah and Hilton Head have contributed to the inland creep of the saltwater plumes, and they will continue to exist even if groundwater withdrawals are eliminated.
Question,
Yes.
comment. So I came from California. In Orange County and Irvine, you have the same issue that's going on in Hilton Head and Savannah. We put in massive amounts of recycled water injection wells, which reverse that process. So instead of taking the recycled water and putting it in the ocean directly, we put it in the groundwater basins and brackish water to, in a sense,
Create a bubble.
create barrier and push it back. Why is that strategy being looked at in South Carolina and Georgia? And if not, why not? I mean, it's been done for 20, 30 years in other areas. What's the barrier to do it here?
Well, I know that we are using treated surface water and treated water from the middle Florida aquifer to put down and keep in the aquifer for times needed
No, I
and
understand
pulled
that.
out. But I don't know of situations where we're creating a freshwater bubble to keep saltwater intrusion at bay.
Because there are wells that exist that are brackish that can't be used, that could be just reversed and injected down to create that bubble. If we have a water plan, I'd certainly like to see a recommendation for our side in that area. Has any other river basin council like Charleston looked at that as an option or discussed this?
Surface
Sandy
water,
RBC hasn't made yet.
We haven't
It will
yet.
be maybe.
Okay.
but surface water costs are so high.
No, I'm not talking about surface water. I'm talking
That's
about,
that's where the water comes from that you would inject.
no, I'm talking about recycled water.
Recycled water is all going on the golf course,
Yeah, that's, yeah.
Not all of it. Not
pretty
all of it.
much. Most of it, there are no surface water discharges in southern Beaufort County. Wastewater discharge. All the wastewater down there, treated is going on the golf course. So to the extent that you want to use something to create a barrier and start push that stuff back, it's gonna have to be either surface water coming from the Savannah River or water that is reworked and reworked and reworked by the local utility. Those are your two choices.
That's what I think this group's talked before, you know, we're working right now actually with DES and we're working on a draft statute, like to what Ken's talking about. Take the recycled water, okay, the highly treated wastewater, recycled water, potentially have the right, you know, regulatory wise to use it to do indirect recharge of the aquifer. And be that, you know, you're recharging what might become the then, you know, drinking water source once you bring it back out and retreat it, or saltwater intrusion barrier type program, like Orange County, California has done for decades. So but right now,
Currently,
we're
it's
working on the
used for
regulatory
irrigation.
world of that.
But currently that water is used for irrigation, correct?
All the recycled water on the island is either going to Gulf, it's gonna be sold to Gulf, but nowhere near all of it. About half of it is just going into the unlined, like you all went and saw with me,
Wetlands.
the unlined wetlands.
Right.
Yeah, so you're doing some indirect recharge already with that. You're taking recycled water, you're putting it in wetlands,
And getting
you're
local recharge.
recharging, you know, over time that way.
But you're just
But
not
this is being-
injecting it in the ground.
Right, injection is being a little more intentional about it, a little more. And that's just right now, there's a regulatory, you have to have the regulatory ability to do that. And then I think the utilities could look at, hey, how do we actually do it from an
I'm
infrastructure?
not interested in any of our recommendations till we get a presentation on the quality of that well, so. I'm not interested in having that part of it.
Until what?
Till I understand how good is that water that's gonna be our future drinking water? I'd like to understand the quality of that.
But you saw, hold on, just a comment. You saw something. Yeah, you saw if they took water out, they'd run it through RO anyways. For drinking.
I'm an engineer as well, and I don't believe hormones get cured by our. Am I right, Pete?
Well, I mean, there's all manner of different things, unregulated things that are already related to.
I'm just saying, I want to understand what going in my future drinking water directly. I'd like to get a presentation before I consider bringing in a recommendation.
There's a lot of track record.
That's a fair thing. Someone could come present this before I would consider making a recommendation.
We're only starting the discussion at the state level.
Yeah, I think.
But we're not the pioneers of it. It's been done in our country.
Then let's get a presentation. All I'm saying is, I heard him say, let's make that a recommendation. And I'm telling you, I'm stepping on the brake on that till
We got a briefing from Florida. Florida is.
I didn't.
I'm just giving you education, though. Florida is getting billions of gallons of water supply from recycled water. That's where their future is. Miami-Dade County spending billions to do a direct root process, recycle it.
I think the information we could probably bring is from other states where they set limits on what is allowed to be injected. because there's no precedent in South Carolina. So that might be good information to show. What are they monitoring for? What are those limits? If South Carolina adopts something similar, what might it be?
So all I'm saying is, I'd like that to be one of our recommendations. I am not there.
Yeah.
So,
Is Savannah Dean doing anything to inject or use their wastewater?
Not right now, no, they've got surface water discharge in the Savannah River. Their main wastewater plants down through,
Or even back in the
going back into the harbor. Now,
crazy? Okay, sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. Okay, so, well, that was it. So, I wanted to show that, groundwater supplies are really important in the basin. They excluding energy over 50% of the, water use. In lieu of this model, we've got the potentiometric maps that go back several years. We have several of those. We have water, data from, DES that's going back, several years, and hydrographs to estimate, how much water has been used and how has it affected our aquifers, and looking at where South Carolina counties are going to grow to make some sound management decisions for this river basin planning process. And I issued address saltwater intrusion continues to be an issue at the coast, and reduction in both South Carolina and Georgia is required to stop the plume growth. There are some instances of saltwater intrusion monitoring going on that I didn't speak of. The USGS has monitoring in the Florida aquifer. There was a well at Dolphin Head when the first saltwater intrusion kind of showed up on Dolphin Head. There was a well that went in to track saltwater intrusion, went from it was installed in 2000 and went to 2022. It was recently decommissioned due to we're really getting more data after 23 years just to know that it was getting saltier and saltier. It went from about 5,000 milligrams per liter to 7,400 milligrams per liter chloride, which was a significant salt impacts. In 2021, they moved that gauge down to Defusky Island. And so in monitoring a similar location in the Florida aquifer, upper Florida aquifer to Defusky Island. And that is an active gauge right now that you can check. It started, the study was prompted from a DHEC study looking at the upper Florida aquifer and found that it was about 350 milligrams per liter there in 2017. The DNR tracked it for a little while, and then working with the USGS moved that gauge. It started in August in 2021, and it went from about 440 milligrams per liter. And currently yesterday it was about 600 milligrams per liter. So, there's plumes of saltwater, they're sitting in there and they're moving around. So it's being tracked in different locations. Hilton Head Public Service District has a periodic program where they look at and identify that 250 milligram per liter chloride line. And then there's a report with some modeling that was done formerly from DHEC that went from a very long time from 2007 to 2017, looking at different locations across the island to help develop a model to where the salt was going, how fast it was moving. And so there's programs in place that have looked at it. So I just wanted to share with the council that the saltwater intrusion is a concern that's been looked at and maybe outside of the realm of this planning process, but it is being tracked. And that is, that's all I have for y'all today. I'm happy to entertain any questions. Thanks.
I have a question that it may not be right down Brooks Lane, but we have data centers being built around the country, and more recently, South Carolina has come to be one of the locations that they've talked about putting data centers in. And the data center uses electricity, but it also uses a lot of water to cool all of the computers in there. Does anybody know if that is recycled or captured after it's gone through a data center?
The water, the cooling centers, the data center, that it's so much heat that all of the water evaporates. Some of it goes into ponds, but it's mostly evaporates. And there has been a push for more data centers to come to South Carolina. I've noticed it in the newspapers. And so that water that they use will be evaporated out of the cooling towers. And, a lot of them have big conservation programs where, they try not to do any harm to look for conjunctive, water uses to do it, but yeah, it's.
And the second phase of this is the amount of water used in a data center equates to a very large number of residential homes. Daily use. 50,000 is the number that's most commonly mentioned. So has anybody else picked up on that potential source of fresh water use?
And you don't get the estimate back.
Yes, sir.
I think one of the issues though, right, is those centers being allowed themselves to have groundwater capacity rights. So they're putting they want to put their own wells in the ground, pump groundwater in the first place.
Or if there's a municipality available to give them discounted water, that's the first choice.
Yeah.
So, yes, they can do wells, but.
One just comment on, on Brooke's final bullet. What we're seeing more and more, right, is that the technology just gets better and better. And so to turn salty water, to turn salty groundwater into drinking water supply is a matter of what kind of technology can you put on it and what kind of infrastructure can you put on it. All things through membranes eventually. So, I mean, I do get a little nervous as a Hilton Head water provider that if we're going to say reduction in pumping, because if Hilton Head can bring the resource to bear to meet its needs with the technology, well, please don't take our water from us, because we'll put it through the membranes and we'll turn it into drinking.
Or allow for other solutions to help improve. So question, John, the process. So groundwater model, not sure what that means. Groundwater presentation. How do we then as a council look at the groundwater cycle over the next 70 years and the demands and data centers and come up with any conclusions with no modeling, or is that not necessary? What's the plan there? Because it's over 50% of the water supply for the basin.
Yeah, so I think the plan without the modeling would be to finish developing the groundwater demands. Those need to be done. You did that on the surface water side. But we need to figure out what are our 50-year projected demands for groundwater, right? And then we can look at historical demands, their impact on the water table heads in the aquifers, look at the future demands, just do kind of a desktop approach of are we concerned about any areas based on where we think there's going to be growth.
Don't we also need to, since the plume's going that way, don't we also need to look at, I mean, I'm just involved in the Richmond Hills project. If you would believe how many dwelling units and building up around the Richmond Hills and that battery plant that they're going to put over there, which is going to be more demand for water. I'm not sure where it's come from, but the more groundwater Georgia takes, the different things affect, him and others, and they're using groundwater too, potentially on the coast, right?
Yep. We'll do the best we can within the planning tools that we have.
And this iteration of planning is based upon water quantity, not quality. So while we can, and that's just the confines of how, the framework was set up for this, that we have to focus on the quantity of water, and then to add in the quality of water, may have to come down the road, but identify.
We're talking about drinking water. So if it's undrinkable, it's because of salt, then it's not that quantity.
That quantity is, I understand that.
So it is going to take the ball.
Right.
Yeah.
In the Edison, where we did groundwater modeling, I think one of the most useful takeaways from that was identifying areas when we looked at 2070 projected demands, where there were going to be potential kinds of depression and drawdowns. And we look at those areas, we realized we don't have much monitoring ability in those areas. So one of the recommendations from the Edison RBC was let's go to Calhoun County and a couple others in the Queen Branch and the Crouch Branch aquifer, put in some monitoring wells. So now we have actual data that we can follow and track over time. We don't need to rely on the model. We can look at any changes there and whether those projected demands are really turning into drawdowns in the aquifer where there was going to be potential significant dewatering. So you take so much water out of the aquifer that it doesn't have any aquifer impact. You can have subsidence, you can have impacts to shallow domestic wells. There's a lot of different impacts that might occur. So that's something that we might be able to, at a grosser scale, decide where do we need more monitoring without the ability to do some of the modeling that we did in the Edisto. We'll do what we can, but there's going to be a limitation to how much useful recommendations we can develop without actually writing models. Any other questions?
Where does the Middendorf fit into all this?
So the Middendorf is no longer called the Middendorf. The Middendorf is the geologic formation.
Yeah.
And there was a push to take the aquifers and the confining units out of those because the Middendorf covered several aquifers and confining layers. And so that's where we came up with the McQueen, the Charleston.
Gotcha.
And so it parsed out. So still there, just kind of, we made it more confusing.
Yeah.
No blame Joe Jalisi. With all the, the nomenclature changes. There's been a lot of nomenclature changes over time, but most recently was in 2010 and we adopted that so that each unit could be looked at differently because we knew that there are different productive zones within that larger Middendorf aquifer, and to parse them out, we can look at water regulation better by parsing them out.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to Joe next. Does anybody want a really, really short break or do you want to just move ahead?
I think we're gonna move ahead.
Okay, Joe, let me pull up your presentation.
All right, thank you, John.
Yep.
All right, I'm Joe Kuhn with DES's Bureau of Water. The Division of Water Resources is kind of a newly formed division within our Bureau of Water to accommodate former DNR's hydrology program. And I'd certainly like to thank the book for presenting today and providing some good information. So for me today, I'm just going to give a general overview of the capacity use area, groundwater management plans, how we created those plans historically, and how we use our water use data to evaluate and permit on a 5-year basis. So the water quantity permitting programs that are within our division are the groundwater use and reporting program and the surface water withdrawal permitting reporting. So both of those programs require reporting if you use more than 3 million gallons in any given month. They're structured differently. The groundwater program's been around since the late 60s, I believe. And so it has resulted in the creation of all the capacity use program areas in the coastal plain. So any users within those capacity use areas are permitted and report, and those in the Piedmont of the state are registered, but they also report, and it's all considered in the annual water use report that DES creates. So what is a capacity use area? So designated by the board for any area that has excessive groundwater withdrawal and presents adverse effects for the natural resources or poses, a threat to public health or human safety. Significant threat to long-term integrity of the groundwater source. So again, this is a program that started back in the 60s. I think the Waccamaw, the Low Country were some of the first areas to be designated, and they've all been designated as capacity use at this time. And so the General Assembly gave us regulatory authority to protect the general welfare and public for groundwater resources, for beneficial use and reasonable regulation, so that we can conserve and protect these resources, prevent waste, and develop our water resources here in South Carolina. So this is kind of just showing that graphically. We're permitting in a way to protect the resource so that we can maintain our water resources for development, and also requiring conservation plans by our water users to prevent waste. So this is a historical representation of those capacity use areas. So the two that we're focused on here in our basin are the Low Country, established in 1981, and more recently, the western in 18. And so all of these areas were established. Well, all but the first one were established under the authority of DHEC and went through a community engagement process, stakeholder process, and ultimately was approved by the DHEC board through a public hearing. So showing those on the map, again, all the areas that are designated as capacity use or require permitting. All those in the upstate are just registered. So groundwater management planning is the way I understand the programs work is as they're designated, part of that designation it requires a groundwater management plan. And so we noticed that, have a public hearing, and I'm going to describe in a little more detail about those groundwater management plans to achieve the goals and objectives of the legislation. So the process to designate a capacity use area and create a groundwater management plan, you convene planning work groups, have meetings, receive written comments, participate in work groups, things of that nature. Get input from stakeholders in that capacity use area on the groundwater management plan. We do present that information in front of the board, and we review and issue permits consistent with that groundwater management plan. And it's good that all of them got designated. The most recent one was the Santee Lynches, I believe, in 21-22, as we with DES no longer have a board. So aspects of water use addressed in the groundwater management plan. So we're going to look at the groundwater sources used, what at the water demand and the type of use. We're going to see if there's any current aquifer storage and recovery or water reuse planned or utilized in that basin. Look at projected population and growth, projected water demand, opportunities for aquifer storage and recovery, and water reuse, and conservation measures. So many of the things that you all are discussing in these basin councils are incorporated into our groundwater management plans. And so as John discussed, in the absence of a model, we'll look at these management plans and the evaluations and incorporate that into these basin plans. So again, structure of a groundwater management plan, pretty, self-explanatory there. We're going to document those trends and demands and take all that into consideration in writing the groundwater management plan. And then every 5 years, we're going to evaluate the water use and then go through a renewal of permits in those capacity use areas. So each management plan has goals. These goals listed here are focused on the low country and western areas. So, basically what we're trying to do is protect the resource through management and sustainable development. We're monitoring that groundwater quality and quantity to evaluate those conditions. And we collaborate with our partners in hydrology to carry out that monitoring. We do have some capacity use wells that have monitoring wells associated with them, but by and large, we're using the monitoring that the hydrology group does to evaluate those conditions. So the goals, especially here in the low country and the capacity use areas along the coast, is to protect against saltwater intrusion. And we do have several pieces of the various plans that promote educational awareness of the resource and its conservation. So we've got many strategies involved with that as well. Go through those. So identify areas where leveling or reduction in pumping are appropriate. So if we evaluate water use and we're looking at potentiometric surface maps and we identify areas where we may recommend no new permitting or no increase in volume of permitting, we'll make those recommendations as part of our evaluation reports. So we'll review those applications during that time for demonstrated reasonable use.
What does number 2 mean? So if I'm permitted for 50 MGD and I only been using 5, what is that? What are you gonna do?
So in those types of scenarios, what we typically do is reach out to the permittee and have a discussion and, you know, confirm that the water use is accurate and go through a conversation with them. And if it is determined that their annual use is 5 MGD and that's where they anticipate that to continue, then typically what we would do is reduce that permitted volume to probably 20% above that 5 MGD, just to give them a little additional capacity and ability there, as it is a reduction, is how we handle that.
And you have authority to do that without, I mean, because I think is that different than surface water permits?
It is very different from surface water permitting, very different. So we do have that authority with the capacity use program. And I think historically from, you know, I'm fairly new to this. I've been involved with this for 2 years. But in talking with Rob Devlin and those that have been involved in this program for many years, it functions very well.
But if, you know, if growth is anticipated, they may not have been using the water, but they want you to be able to access the water.
Again, we would.
Growth that may occur,
Sure.
I mean, you know, what is demonstrated reasonable? I mean,
Yeah, so we certainly are going to have a conversation with the permittee before we would go down the road of any reductions. And again, base that off of their historical water use over the last 5 years. And, you know, if
For the last 5 years is not indicative of what the
sure,
coming 20
but
years.
many of these capacity users have been in place for 10, 20, 30 years. So we have historical use we can look back on. And then if they demonstrate the need and it's reasonable.
Where is that need and reasonable? Because like in ag, we have the same issue because you're gonna request more than needed in case there's
Right.
drought.
Sure.
Instances where
So you're looking at the
not
type of crop you're growing over what amount of acres you're growing. And so we take all that into account in calculating what a reasonable water use would be. And also comparing that with your historical use.
So why the rules different for groundwater and surface water?
That's a great question.
Statutes.
I know, but why? It's the same water, and if you're a utility that needs to get it from the ground, you gotta operate under one set of guidelines, and if it's you get it from the surface, it's just a separate set.
Yeah. So overall, we do encourage conjunctive use. And it's one of the things that we can do in managing our groundwater use is to encourage folks to have surface water resources and storage resources on the surface too. Why it's different? There's probably somebody can answer that question a little better, but like any
Politics.
yeah, any legislative process, I think they began developing the surface water law sometime around 09, 08, 09, and then they got the law done in around 11 or 12.
And it was a knife fight.
Yeah.
From the.
I know Dean was involved probably, so yeah, I mean,
That's why the only people that have to get surface water withdrawal permit essentially are the municipalities and industries. Agriculture does not. They register what they want to use, and that's monitored, but they do not have to get a permit. So, effectively, in many cases, they are registering a demand, and registering the proposed withdrawal that may not be needed right now, maybe needed in the future, but not now. So it's very political. And EPA has come in basically and told the state it's not acceptable. The EPA has told them, you gotta fix this and work it.
so I'll try to continue to focus this on the capacity use area program for today. I think maybe the surface water presentation has been done. in this basin early
Yeah, we'll
on?
probably have a refresher when we get to talking about policy regulatory legislative recommendations.
Right.
Later on.
And I'll be glad to provide a refresher at that time. So these are the continued of the strategies we use in developing the groundwater management plans. So moving on. So moving on, every 5 years, we have the groundwater management plan established. And then every 5 years, we go through an evaluation of the water use for that capacity use area. We do that, say, in year 23, and then in year 24, 2023, 2024, we actually renew those permits based off of that evaluation report. So we compile all the groundwater withdrawals, compare those to hydrographs and aquifer potentiometric surface maps. All permitted withdrawals, permitted limits, and average groundwater withdrawals are listed. Withdrawals are evaluated by category and aquifer. Areas of aquifer stress are identified, and then we summarize those results and we make recommendations. And some of those may include renewal restrictions, requirement for modeling to be brought to bear when a new permit is considered or an increase in volume is considered, things of that nature, as appropriate. So again, this is that map showing the capacity use areas in the state with the outline of this basin. So showing the western area to the north there and the low country area to the south. And just wanted to summarize for those two areas, the capacity use areas, what we've done. So in the low country, we did an assessment and evaluation report in 21, and then we renewed those permits in 22. So in 26, we'll go through that process again and renew permits in 27. In the western, we just did that evaluation. So we're currently going through renewing those western permits, which that's one of our higher volume of permits across the coastal plain. And then, of course, that'll be done again in 28, 29.
Joe, are the 2021 and 2023 assessment and evaluation reports posted online?
Yes.
So the RBC could review those.
That's right.
Maybe that's a good start for us learning more about it.
Yeah, I'm glad
Get
to.
into water management strategy discussion and everything. Read both of those.
Sure.
That's the most recent information.
Yeah, I'm glad to provide links to those. So they're available online to download and review. So that's all I had. Glad to answer any questions.
And those two reports are separate than the groundwater management plan for each area, right?
They are. So when you go onto our website, we've got it separated about all the capacity use areas. And then for those that have been around for a while, we'll have that groundwater management plan. And then we'll have several evaluation reports available. I think. We may just have the most recent one, but we can certainly make them available.
Starting with the most recent one.
Sure.
That's important now.
Right. Okay.
Joe, is the general tendency that you're seeing in this part of the world that these withdrawals are increasing at a fairly rapid rate?
I don't know that I can definitively answer that question for these areas specifically. If anything, I would say that the Western is probably has increased a bit more. It's younger and maybe some new users more so in that area. But I don't know that I can answer that for the Low Country.
It's tricky to assess trends in groundwater. It's tricky to assess trends in groundwater because you have better reporting of it. So what's just better reporting versus what's actually irrigation? Could be tricky. So we think there's been more irrigation. But how much, how strong is that trend? Hard to tell just because we have better.
Yeah, and in my learning, as I've been involved in this program, I think we've kind of maybe gotten over that hump mostly. You know, the Santee Lynch's is brand new, so you might have that early on, but most of them have been established. So we feel fairly confident in our reporting.
So we should be an assessment pattern going forward.
Certainly.
How do you get your data? Is it voluntary? Is it state equipment and state monitored?
So they report to the data to us on an annual basis.
The users do.
The users do.
And it's metered in all instances.
No, it's not metered in all instances. No, it's not. We don't have metering requirements in South Carolina. So we send out a mail out, and plus we have a system, online e-permitting system. So users can either fill out a paper form or fill out a form online. And, you know, if they're not metered, some are, they're basing their reporting on, you know, pump capacity and logging the pump.
Why didn't the state require metering?
Well, that would be a statutory change, I believe. So.
I'm sorry to ask an uncomfortable question, but
Sure.
it's a pretty obvious one.
Right. So, I mean, something we could look into.
Well, public water systems are required to.
Exactly. The municipals are so
Right, but
required.
agricultural are not.
So that's probably required under a different set of regulations. We have our drinking water supply regs.
Any other questions for Joe?
All right, thank y'all.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay, we're about out of time, so I think what we'll do is finish our drought recommendations in November. There's only a few more. But I do want to quickly talk about the plan for October, which is Jeff still online?
I'm here.
Jeff? Sorry about that. Jeff's been working on an agenda for the RBC to visit Savannah River site. Jeff, do you want to just kind of quickly talk about the different options of things that we could see, and maybe we can get some feedback from the RBC to help you further develop that agenda?
Sure. We basically take water out of the ground and out of the river. We have our own treatment facilities to create domestic drinking water. We have our own sanitary sewer. We have a pump house down on the river that it doesn't pull as much water as it used to, but it's still pretty impressive to see. You know, we've got a number of different monitoring processes. We've got some remediation processes that we're doing on water. You know, we can even drive over and look at the reactors that have been shut down and filled with concrete. So there's a number of different things that what I'm struggling with is that the site is 300 square miles. And so sometimes it can take 30 or 40 minutes to get from one spot to the next. So you know, I want to make sure that we hit the things that you guys want to see. We have the Savannah River Ecology Lab is there. That's a pretty interesting tour. You know, we can do whatever you guys want. But we'll have to make sure that when we select things that, you know, we're not going to spend an hour in the bus going from one place to another. So did that help at all?
Yeah, so I think the intake on the Savannah is certainly one thing we'd want to see. If we included that on the agenda, what else is within a reasonable driving distance of it?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Yeah, so from there, I mean, sanitary sewer, we also use the river water to make steam. We have a biomass plant that primarily makes steam, but also generates electricity. And that's the main use for the river water. And then, you know, we have a number of facilities that use a lot of water that, you know, even just driving by them would give you a feel for the scale of the operation and how much water that we use. And There's some new facilities that are just being built that'll come online in 8 or 10 years that'll use large amounts of water as well. So
Is it,
those are some of the things that we can do. You know, this is a difference between we can drive by some stuff and have somebody tell us about it. And then
Yep.
there's other spots where we're going to want to get off the bus, walk around, look at stuff. So, you know, we can try to make it as interesting as possible.
you mentioned ecology lab, Savannah River Ecology Lab.
Yes, it's run by the University of Georgia.
Okay. Is that a mainly an inside tour? What would we see there? How long would that take?
Yeah, it's mainly an inside tour. But you know, there is some walking around from different spots. I mean, you know, they got the famous alligator that's gargantuan that, you know, everybody wants to go see. He's outside, but
Snuffy's his
you know,
name.
they can talk to you about the monitoring. You know, we just heard about monitoring wells. You know, they can tell you something about how the water, the groundwater is monitored, and there's a number of plumes of chemicals that were used 50 years ago that are monitored very closely. And you know, there's so that's kind of it's not really quality, I mean quantity of water, but it is definitely will impact quality and quantity if it gets into the Savannah River. So that's another area that we could look at. We have a system called phytoremediation, and it's simple concept, and there's not a whole lot to see, but when you drive by it and hear about it, it's pretty interesting. It's how we get tritium out of the water. We also have processes to get volatile organic compounds out of the water. We have areas where the groundwater is very acidic, and we inject a basic solution to neutralize it. So things like that.
Okay. RBC folks, from what you've heard, is there anything that stands out that you think would be most useful to visit?
I think you covered a lot of it. I mean, I sent him a separate email, Jeff, this is Bill Robinson, I sent you an email on my record.
Yeah, thanks. I got that. That's a pretty good tour there.
Yeah. Pardon me?
I was just thinking, you guys know better than just.
It is, you know, 10, 20 miles between spots, so you can cover a lot on the bus.
Yeah.
But that, to save time, I think trying time for lunch is probably, there's very few places to eat there, so.
Okay.
I don't. How much time would the council want to go spend? I think Jeff would probably even know that, as I kind of found it. Is it just the 4 hours? Can go an extra hour?
Right. What do y'all?
We can't do much less than probably 3 hours and see anything. But we could go all day if you want to.
Yeah, but my original thought would be, you know, same thing as we're doing here, 10 to 4 with a, you know, half-hour lunch break. But you all,
10 to 2.
I'm sorry, 10 to 2, excuse me. Yeah, so 4 hours basically. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, he's gonna have to have a.
Yeah.
Driving speed limit.
Okay.
Meeting at the front gate.
Yeah, we'll have to give you specifics on where to meet. And Jeff, I'm assuming you would provide a bus and.
Yeah, we'll provide a bus, and I'm setting up various people to meet us in different places so that you can get kind of the expert knowledge from people that really know the process that we're looking at really well.
Okay. And where would we convene? Where would we drive to? Where would we all meet you?
So the SRS has what they call the badge office. It's on SRS 1, which runs between 278 and South Carolina 125. And so that's basically where we'll have to meet, and you'll go into the badge office and get a secure badge, and then we'll climb onto a bus and do the tour, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Jeff sent me a link yesterday that I'll distribute to you all. We need to go to that website and what is it gonna ask for, Jeff?
The mainly just name and address, but it is gonna ask you to confirm you're a US citizen, and it's gonna ask you for your social security number. And the only thing that they're gonna use it for is to check your identity and see if you're on the terrorist watch list or anything like that, right? And then when you arrive, you're gonna need to have certain types of ID. I also sent a file along with that link that kind of describes. I think if you've got a Georgia driver's license, then you're fine. I'm not sure about South Carolina if you're real ID at this point or not. But if you've got a real ID, you know, with I think it's a white circle with a gold star or a gold circle with a white star. That's an acceptable form. But if you don't have proper identification, they will not let you in.
Okay.
So please review that document and make sure you bring something that will be acceptable.
All right, I'll distribute that as well tomorrow.
Jeff, there's a contraband list too. Someone asked me about contraband potentially in their cars.
Yeah, where you're gonna park your cars, you're not gonna go through any of the gates. You won't be able to you don't want to have any contraband on your person, because we're gonna load the bus outside of the gate, and then we're gonna go probably down to the pump house first, because it's outside of kind of the secured area, and then we'll go back into the secured area from there. But yeah, there's a list of contraband that if you look at the website link that I sent, there's some links off of that give you information on, you know, where it is, where to meet, you know, what you can and cannot bring on site, that kind of stuff.
And Jeff, it sounds like since we're gonna be in a bus and some of the tour will be inside or from the bus, even if it's rainy, we could still go ahead with the tour unless it's just.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We can still go forward we can, you know, bring your umbrellas and we'll make it happen.
Okay. Okay, I'll catch back up with you to help finalize the agenda. But I think we've got enough information, and I'll distribute what you sent me to the RBC and we'll go from there.
Okay.
Anything else you want to add, or?
It's pretty interesting place. You know, there's a lot more than we use a lot of water, and we've contaminated a lot of water, and we're cleaning up a lot of water. So it's pretty interesting facility, and there's a lot of things have gone on there that are also pretty interesting, and you know, we'll drive around and see some of them.
Well, great. Thank you for arranging all this for us. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Okay. Anybody have anything else? Otherwise, you want to.
Quick comment.
Yeah, Scott.
I think I'm missing one or two shit. If you haven't signed this, please stop by and get your signature on it.
Do we have a motion to adjourn? Plan, Ken, thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Here.
Thanks, Jeff.
You know, Sharon.